We good with broadcasting? Yep. I declare open this public hearing of the Joint Committee of Public Accounts and Audit for the inquiry into Commonwealth procurement. Would like to thank witnesses for being here today. We call representatives of the Department of Home Affairs and the Australian National Audit Office. For the Hansard record, could you each please state your name and the capacity in which you appear before the committee?
Tim Fitzgerald, Deputy Commissioner, Australian Border Force.
Leanne Monterosso, First Assistant Secretary, Procurement, Property and Contracts Division.
And Justine Saunders, Chief Operating Officer.
Michael Outram, Commissioner of the Australian Border Force. Mike Pizzulo, Secretary of the Department.
Rhoda Mellor, Acting Auditor General.
Carla Jago, Group Executive Director, Performance Audit at the ANAO.
Thank you. This hearing is a formal proceeding of the Parliament, and the giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of the Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. I remind committee members that an officer of a department or the Commonwealth should not be asked to give opinions on matters of policy and should be given reasonable opportunity to refer questions to superior officers, but I suppose given the Secretary is here, to the Minister. However, this does not preclude questions asking for explanations of policies or factual questions about when and how policies were adopted. Officers of the department are also reminded that any claim that it would be contrary to public interest to answer a question must be made by a minister and should be accompanied by a statement setting out the basis for the claim. Now, this is a follow-up hearing, and I think we had an initial discussion with officers from your department who were as helpful as they can be, and I tried to make that clear in the hearing, although we were a bit frustrated about some aspects. And we have received thorough answers to the questions on notice as a starting point. So is there anything you'd like to add at the outset to the department?
I do, Mr Chair, have a brief opening statement, if I may.
Sure.
The Border Force Commissioner, Michael Outram, and I appear before the committee to discuss the department's response to the Auditor General's report number 6 of 21-22. The report, as you know, made 4 recommendations focused on developing and managing the next surveillance services contract. The department has accepted these recommendations and is committed to implementing them. While the department and the Border Force acknowledge the opportunity for improvements in the next contract, we do not necessarily agree with the conclusion that this report arrived at, that contract management has not been effective and that services fell short of the contractual requirements. We did not agree for a number of reasons, which I'll briefly summarise. The report, in our view, does not adequately consider the outcomes-based nature of the contract or the complex and dynamic civil maritime security operating environment in which the contract itself operates. The latter has significantly changed since the contract began as a result of the evolving maritime threat landscape and the establishment of Operation Sovereign Borders in 2013. The majority of the concerns raised by the ANAO, which we do acknowledge are historical in nature and related to the period between 2008-2017. The department's significant improvements in contract management since this time have not been fully recognised in our view in the report. These have included the establishment of the role of Chief Procurement Officer, who attends with me at the table here, Ms Monterosso, in 2019, enhanced contract management tools and processes, and the additional recruiting of experienced contract management staff. The contract has been flexible and delivered essential services during a critical time for Australia's national security. And if I can just conclude in brief, the department commenced planning for a replacement capability as long ago as November 2016. Industry engagement occurred under the previous government in 2018, 2020, 2021. However, the absence of a long-term capital investment program for civil maritime security continues to present challenges in procuring and delivering new and highly complex capabilities. Previous governments have chosen to address immediate civil maritime security capability needs through the funding of pre-investment analysis and risk reduction activities, but have typically deferred long-term investment in these capabilities. To inform decision-making on the length of term required for an extension of the current contract while a procurement was being progressed with government, the ABF Commissioner and I approved in August of 21 a market sweep to establish industry capacity to deliver a like-for-like capability, replacement capability for the current fixed-wing system. 9 domestic and international aviation services and technology companies were invited to participate in the market sweep, and 8 accepted the invitation. The market sweep indicated that full delivery of a like-for-like replacement capability could most likely not be achieved by service providers other than the incumbent before at least 2025. To ensure that there was no critical capability gap, therefore, on the 30th of September 2021, in line with the Commonwealth procurement rules and the power that I have under those rules, I agreed to enter into a 6-year extension out to 31 December 2027, with the current service provided to ensure continuity of this critical border security capability and to provide adequate time for transition, should the government so agree. Within this current arrangement, there are options to transition out early in either 2025 or 2026 if the market can deliver the full capability prior to the expiry of the contract in December of 2027. And if I can conclude, Mr Chair, by saying that whilst, of course, I'm the overall accountable officer under the PGPA, I've delegated authorities and budget to the Border Force Commissioner for the operation of the capability, and I say that just so that there's a shorter line of responsibility and accountability for the actual deployment of the capability, but of course I retain overall responsibility, and the department particularly is responsible for overall procurement and looking at the next generation of procurement in line with the comments I made towards the end of my statement. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that opening statement. That is very helpful, actually. It neatly summarises, I think, a fairly voluminous set of questions on notice. I just want to step back for a moment and take the helicopter view. And look, do thank you. I think the last time you were here was November 2016, when we were doing an inquiry into a report about failures in procurement in the Department of Home Affairs. But by the expiry of this latest contract, if contract variation, if it runs full term, the contract worth about $2.6 billion will not have been competitively tendered for 21 years. Is that acceptable?
No. No, in my view, and I'll avoid the expression of a policy preference, and these are matters ultimately for government, and this extends over a number of governments: the Howard government, the Rudd government, the Gillard government, the Abbott government, the Turnbull government and the Morrison government. I think anyone looking at that period and looking at the issue would accept, and I know that we've got a former Defence Minister here on the committee, that the best practice in this area would be to have an integrated investment approach that gives departments and their agencies an operating certainty to say, here is your envelope of funding for a particular capability. At certain points, the technology will evolve, and we'd like you at periodic periods to go and test the market. It might be, for instance, that uninhabited aerial vehicles can perhaps do a better job. A new form of satellite constellation might do a better job. But in the meantime, you'll need to keep flying these aircraft, obviously with Operation Sovereign Borders and like requirements, not just limited to unauthorised maritime arrivals, but for other reasons. You've got to keep the capability going. Any sensible business practice, whether in the private sector or the public sector, would accept that there's a need to periodically recapitalise your fleet, and that's always, of course, going to be a matter for government. There's no question there that it's not a matter for officials to determine government policy in that regard, but absent clear, predictable funding lines, the Secretary, and it doesn't matter, Mr Hill, who was in this job, was faced with the devil's choice of either saying, I'm going to let the capability expire because I'm not going to renew or extend or roll over through options and extension periods of capability, and then I have to say to ministers, I have no aircraft to support the OSB mission. So I'm left in it with a devil's choice. My preference, and I'm just stating as a preference, I'm not expressing a policy view, is that like the Department of Defence, the better model, or indeed I could say like BHP or indeed any large enterprise that's got large complex machinery, is that you've got a predictable pattern of recapitalisation. You're either funded, and I accept that budget decisions have to be taken about whether cash is appropriated in a provisional sense, as it is, say, in the Defence Department, or at least you have planning certainty to say, right, we accept that there's a recapitalisation point for this entire fleet, and the same would apply to vessels, so I'm not limiting these remarks to aircraft. That would be the better position. So you're asking me about whether it's acceptable. I think you're asking me, in a sense, for an opinion, Mr Hill, but I am willing to respond in kind. I don't think it's acceptable, and I think government policy in this area should be revisited.
Because we are left wondering, when you step back from it, it seems like the department, governments successively, as you say, have adopted the view that there's no one else in the world that could provide these services. And so
I'm not sure that I agree, Mr Hill, if I could say respectfully. There have been market sweeps. There have been, within the limited funds available...
We'll get to the market sweep.
Yes. So within the limited funds available and without any certainty about a recapitalisation budget, because of course you can't tender with a proper, under the procurement arrangements of the Commonwealth quite properly, you can't go to market and say, I'm not sure if I'm going to have money, so I'm going to do a full tender process where I'm going to expect you to spend a lot of money in working up a tender proposal which may or may not go ultimately to funding. Now, some procurements can be arranged on a variation of that, but it's typically not the practice.
Well,
We don't assume that there are no other forms of doing this. I said myself, there could be unmanned or uninhabited vessels that could do it, vehicles, satellite systems. We would certainly prefer to embark on a tender sooner rather than later to see what's out there.
because, I mean, what this means is that other companies have not been given the opportunity for nearly
Quite.
2 decades to tender and test whether taxpayers are getting the best value for money, or
I
whether
couldn't agree with you more.
Australians are getting the world's best surveillance technology. The latest nearly $1 billion variation, approved by you, as you described it, a devil's choice, make the plane stop flying or be done over by the contractor yet again, approved by you and the former minister and the former prime minister. But I'm not having a go at the former prime minister or acting prime minister as it was, or minister in this instance, because they're also jammed. But they approved it. You all approved it on the basis of urgency.
Yes.
Is that correct? Because no one else was able to provide the services in the time available.
Well, to take a step back, we didn't even have a tender to put out to market. So I have some capacity to do a direct procurement, a direct sole source. So, if you like, within the appropriations that are in my budget, I can say, look, I'm not going to extend this contract. Could someone actually stand up on the morning after the expiry of the current term? And then I would have to take some risk without a full competitive tender, without a capital budget, to say, can you swap a capability in, hence the market sweeps.
Let's accept for a moment, by the time you get to that point, many years on from when you started thinking about it, by the time you get to that point, it's difficult to see any other decision that could be made.
Quite.
Or the plane stopped flying.
Quite.
But so urgency was the basis, and that's clear
Quite.
from the questions
Yes.
on notice. It was also clear, though, when I read all of the questions, that the department was well aware, and you touched on in your opening statement, that this multi-billion-dollar contract was expiring years before October 21. You commenced for planning for a future aerial surveillance capability in 2016. I flew on one of these planes on the Defence Force
Yes.
parliamentary program, I think around 2017.
Yes.
From memory. Spent a day up there. They were chatting to me then about changes, and
Yes.
the procurement process was coming. They were going to be tendered.
Yep.
Weren't that optimistic about keeping the tender, unmanned aerial
Yes.
surveillance, all of
Yes.
that stuff. It was in 2017, drones. You had 3 formal industry engagements since 2018, an RFI in October, supplementary information in late 2020, the competitive market sweep.
Yes.
But the market sweep was done 2 months before the contract expired.
The market
The $1
sweep,
billion variation.
The market sweep was, so if I go right back to the period that you've just described, in 2016, we did start to plan for a replacement. I have to say, and I've got to be cautious here a bit in terms of divulging confidences that are the subject of cabinet deliberations.
Well, you did brief the minister 8 times since 2019.
Quite, and that's on the public
Former
record, and you can take it from that. We weren't just sleepwalking forward without putting up new policy proposals, budget submissions, alerting new ministers in incoming ministerial briefs. You're familiar with the way in which government works. It's not as though we were saying, gosh, one day someone's going to have to go out for a tender, we'll just leave it down the track. You put up proposals, and in tough budget circumstances, although I have to say now with $1 trillion on the public debt, one would say that the budget now is even tougher, but certainly the view taken at the time, and these are matters for government in the end and not officials.
Well, that's true,
You make choices about funding.
But if we're saying it's all government's fault because they didn't give you a funding envelope to go to tender years before, Blind Freddie would also know that when you jam the Prime Minister at the end of a process, or the Minister jams the Prime Minister, however we look at it, indeed the Prime Minister actually was the Minister for Home Affairs secretly, but you didn't know that, so you couldn't have briefed both of your ministers. But when you jam them at the end of that, what are they going to do but roll over the $1 billion? So on one hand, you're saying you didn't have a funding envelope, that's why you couldn't go to tender. On the other hand, you get to the 11th hour and you get the money anyway, because everyone knows you're going to get the money because it's surveillance planes.
So there's two different types of funding at play here. There is the money that's in your appropriation for operations, maintenance and continuing activities. That's in our base. I have, in a sense, theoretically, in the base of the budget of the department, money that stretches into infinity for running the current fleet. When you recapitalise a fleet, just like if you've got a fleet of 10 Corollas but you decide that the proper capability is 15 BMWs, you can't do a like-for-like without a recapitalisation. And that's why, say, in the Defence Department, you have a whole series of projects where the Defence Minister comes forward
I'm more
and you get a
familiar than I would
capital
wish with
injection to
Defence
get the
capital
new
budget,
fleet.
as is the Deputy Chair.
Well, then it should be self-evident to anyone, I think, listening to these proceedings that you need two types of money at play here. Your ongoing budget, so I'm funded for this contract, which I can extend, taking some risk. I would take exception, and I think you're using the term in not an overly pejorative sense, but the sense that I would jam a minister, I would not ever accept, Mr Hill, so I'll seek to have...
Well, I did correct myself on the way through and say, well, the Home Affairs Minister, if you want to take it up a level,
Yes.
jam the Prime Minister at the end, because what are you going to do?
Well, I'm not going to... Well, I respectfully not accept that characterisation. If I can speak with
The government all right, let's take it another way. The government jammed itself.
Well, you can describe it as you wish. I'll describe it in the factual terms that I would choose to give as evidence. Miss Andrews, who was the Minister at the time, made it very clear to me, and I don't think I'm going to breach any confidence here because I've given evidence on this before in, I think, April or May of last year, that she wasn't satisfied with the position that the department had, in a sense, created, and to which I said,
Sure.
Miss Andrews, you face two choices. You either get me a capital budget so I can recapitalise the fleet, or I quickly check and see if anyone without any capital can just simply swap their set of planes, which are flying, capable and able, out for the planes that the company known as Cobham at the time had, or I've got to extend, because otherwise we'll have an even darker discussion or a more just unsatisfactory discussion where I say I have no aircraft.
So can I just check my understanding of the market sweep? I've been told, and you said in your opening statement, the department invited 9 respondents to participate and 8 took up the offer.
I believe so, yes.
It was a highly secretive process where they were then required to sign deeds of confidentiality, and industry participants, I'm told, were given a week or less of preparation time, then told when they'd have a 30-minute meeting online with the department the following week, within 5 days, 4 days in some cases. Is that accurate?
I might ask either the Chief Operating Officer or the Commissioner or one of his colleagues to... I mean, I directed the process, I didn't run it, so some of those matters of fact I just don't know as a matter of knowledge. Who's best placed to answer the...
I'm pretty sure it is, but...
I suspect you're right, because your questions are quite detailed, yes. Who can speak to the conduct of the sweep?
No, and this is one of the issues, I suppose, that there's this changing parade of faces in the department that felt a little bit like the person holding the baby at the end of the contract from the last hearing. The market sweep, though, then let's presume that's accurate. It was 2 months before the end of the contract. Wasn't it just an exercise, though, in trying to prove something that you already knew? The proverbial blind Freddy, to bring him back.
No, it was the last check. It was something that the Minister and I agreed we should at least have a look at. It was done on my authority, but she was concerned to ensure that we left no stone unturned to ensure that there was a value for money attempt, even at the 11th hour. She was entirely, as was, I have to say, Mr Dutton, who was the Minister prior to that, entirely clear in their view that both ministers, that we, notwithstanding those limitations around capital funding, and which I've dealt with, that we were to achieve the maximum value for money within the limit of funds that were in our appropriation. Mr Dutton made that clear to me, as did Ms Andrews.
But I mean, really, they're just words.
Well, I'm sorry. How would you like me to communicate with you?
I mean, they're nice rhetorical words, but how do you ensure value for money when there's no competitive process for 21 years?
We're in a loop, Mr Hill. There's no competitive process because there's no capital program that I can go out to market with. So I think I've made that very clear. I cannot explain that any more clearly.
Was there any reasonable expectation in the market sweep that... Did anyone seriously think that any other company might just have 10 new surveillance planes hanging around?
Possibly. I wasn't going to exclude my mind to that.
They'd find security-cleared crews, support staff, supply contracts, landside estate and get them all up in the air in 2 months?
It is the case, Mr Hill, that with the privatisation of a lot of these services around the world, particularly since 9/11, you've got a lot of companies out there that are not government-run or owned, who provide logistics services, surveillance services. They provide services in support of military operations in theatres such as the Middle East. You would not want to exclude your mind from that. Now, was it a high probability that someone just happened to have 10 aircraft with the large radome and the radar fitted to it with the processing capability in the back of the aircraft that the Dash 8 provides? Unlikely. But from a value for money point of view, the government's perfectly entitled to say...
I mean, I did mention other factors, security cleared crew,
Yes.
landside estate.
It was not going to be likely, but in the spirit of leaving no stone unturned, it was the right thing to do.
All right, if we're doing creative script writing or fiction, I'd welcome a scenario where all of those factors could be...
I won't comment on your comment.
I mean, I can't see how the superficial consultation could possibly have given business the necessary time to develop comprehensive and even competitive responses. If they were given less than a week to prepare a presentation, then half an hour online to talk at the department, it sounds like a ticker box. Or are you actually trying to tell us it was a serious, well-constructed exercise that a contractor could have scoured the globe to find their spare assets and assemble them into a PowerPoint in 4 days?
As I said, at any one point in time, there are global aviation companies that might be coming off a contract where they're doing similar work for other governments. It would have been irresponsible of us not to check. How would you do it properly? Exactly as your question is premised. With a capital budget, a proper tender, a tender evaluation team, and just like the Defence Department does, a pre-first pass examination by government, a first pass examination of options, a second pass funding approval, and then a tender and contract. Point. We know how to do that.
So let's just have a look at the year then. In March 21, you authorised an extension of 2 years from December 21, and then the magical market sweep mysteriously happened 6 months later in August, 5 months later in August. And then in September, you, the Minister and the Acting Prime Minister, approved a 6-year extension. Why did 2 change to 6, and why wasn't the market sweep done in March?
I think the Chief Operating Officer's got the procurement details. To be honest, I was resisting any kind of lengthy extension. My preference would be to go short to see if we couldn't convince government to provide that recapitalisation authority that you need, because if you're just simply swapping out the 10 aircraft that we have for, as you say, 10 aircraft that someone magically might happen, which if you can do it, you're fine, but you do need that recapitalisation funding otherwise. I think it's fair to say, Commissioner, that you and I had discussions about how long I should extend and exercise my powers, and I was reluctant to go long. But Ms Saunders, do you have the exact change, the dates regarding the change from the 2 years to the 6 years?
Yeah, no, can, Chair. So Chair, as the Secretary indicated, obviously, challenge the proposition that the contract should be extended for a significant period of time, and that we actually did need to go out to tender, as you suggested, and on that basis made a decision that we'd extend the contract for a period of 2 years to 31 December 2023 with the provision of a further 1-year extension. So on the basis of going forward to that, obviously then, and I should point out, and I apologise we weren't clear on the issue of the market sweep, the actual part of the department that did the market sweep at that time was the strategy division, who's not here today, but we're happy to take further details in relation to the particular sweep itself on notice. But on the back of that guidance, obviously work was undertaken, engagement occurred with government, and on the back of those on the back of that engagement, decision was made that we would really need to go out and do that market sweep, which then did occur.
I'm not understanding why a 2-year extension was approved, reluctantly, as you say. A 2-year extension was approved, and then from the outside there's a black hole, stuff was happening.
I've conferred with the Commissioner, as I recall it, the company itself was concerned about wear and tear and its own need to recapitalise, and I think, if I recall it, Commissioner, their own capital investment, because they have to take out either loans or find their own money to recapitalise. They wanted more certainty than I think we're willing to give them.
There's obsolescence on some of the equipment inside the Dash 8s.
That's right.
So there was the information system, the optical sensors, the radar. A lot of those were end of life.
This is during the period of Cobham's ownership.
That's right. Yeah.
So let's pretend we'll do a role play. I'm the contractor, and you're the department. And I go...
Well, I don't have to play that role.
No, that's right. Okay, yeah. I'll step into character. So I'm the contractor, and you're the department. Yep. And I'm thinking, oh, God, I'm going to get screwed on this contract. I'm really not very confident about winning. And the department comes to me and says, we'd like a 2-year extension. I go, oh, there's wear and tear. I just don't think I can do 2 years.
Well, we fly the plane, so we know how fatigued they are.
That's right. But I don't think I can do 2 years. Give me 6. I mean, they've got you over a barrel.
I wouldn't characterise it like that, but when you're a monopoly provider to a government that's got an outsourced capability, because the other alternative, of course, is to have this as a fly a small air force within the border force, which or to divest the function to defence. But in a circumstance where we're in, where you've got a contracted provider to what used to be the Customs and Border Protection Service, now the Australian Border Force, you're always going to have a circumstance where you've got a single provider and a department that's reliant on it, and until that department's given a recapitalisation authority, then you're always going to have that dynamic at play.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like a great negotiating position to be in.
Which is why.
So effectively, they're recapitalising, putting new technology in, and they want a payback period.
Of course. Yep. And we need aircraft to fly, because otherwise the worst outcome is for me to say to my minister, forget about procurement issues, I can't surveil the ocean.
Yep.
That's a much worse outcome.
Yep. Okay. Well, look, that's what struck me as
especially
the obvious.
Especially when boats are still a threat.
It probably would have been better just to say that. We're in a weak negotiating position and we needed to recapitalise.
I'm not going to accept the characterisation of that, because when you're in a monopoly provider position, you have robust negotiations, not necessarily weak ones.
You did say, I think, in your opening statement or an earlier response, that you concluded from the market sweep that no one could provide the planes till at least 2025, hence the extension.
On a like-for-like.
On a like-for-like. From the market sweep, albeit in less than a week and 4 days' notice and half an hour, one of the respondents at least told you that they had 3 planes they could stand up immediately and could source more, but that was the end of the process. No one was afforded the chance to identify any additional aircraft, to offer a graduated capability that bought aircraft, additional ones, in a timely manner, or that had a 2-year or 3-year. I mean, the market might have a preference for 3 years, but that's a different question. And I've spoken to 2 contractors who said, of course we could stand something up in 2 years.
Well,
so
we needed 10 more immediately. But I don't know, is there anyone at the table who can assist the chair with answering that question?
I mean,
Chair, if I can just add, you were quite right, and there's been obviously some media reporting in regards to this issue. So in regards to obviously Team Coast Watch, they certainly indicated that they would have the ability to transition a capability. The concern from those that undertook the sweep, as I understand it, were that there are a number of assumptions and caveats by all of the respondents. And on that basis, and noting the critical gap that would emerge if we didn't have confidence in their ability to deliver the capability, obviously the better position to take to ensure that didn't occur was to continue the arrangements with Leidos on the back of that sweep.
OSB is just too critical. I wasn't going to accept things on a promise.
Yeah. So, just back on the urgency issue.
What does it mean he wasn't going to accept?
It's a good question. What do you mean by you weren't going to accept things on a promise?
I needed continuity of capability. If the Commissioner and I weren't absolutely confident that we'd wake up one morning and there were 10 aircraft, maybe painted in different livery, the worst outcome for me would be to say to the Home Affairs Minister, I cannot patrol the ocean.
So back on the urgency issue, or reason or excuse, probably reason at that point, even before the giant $1 billion variation we're discussing, this contract had been varied 40 times, reshaped and increased in value by 29%. It does make me curious whether this avoidance of competition through variations in Home Affairs is endemic. You probably need to take this on notice, but how many procurements have been entered into, including new parent contracts or variations to existing contracts, using the urgency justification, say since 2014, when you became Secretary of the predecessor department?
Either the Chief Operating Officer or the Chief Procurement Officer.
I'd have to take that on notice, Chair.
I'm interested in this, and I might just draw your attention in considering an answer to the report the Auditor General tabled only last week, actually, on Australian government procurement contract reporting, and page 23 has a table 3.5, and it lists the top 10 entities by the number of contract amendments over a decade to 2022. Now, probably the number of contracts and billion-dollar values is not the best metric, because you're a pretty big, messy service department. You do urgent stuff. But you won the prize across the entire public service of any agency over 10 years, 49%. The proportion of total value for the entity committed by contract amendments, 49%. So you almost got to half, but half of the value of taxpayer money flowing out of your department over the last decade has not been through competitive processes. It's been because someone decided to vary the contract.
So,
Is that acceptable?
I'm delighted that you've given me the opportunity to restate the point. The only other department that is like us is the Defence Department. We're smaller in scale, but we run a small Air Force, we run a small Navy, if you want to use that term, and in the detention space, we run services that are akin to custodial and detention services. We have been not afforded, and something which is a matter for government, I'm not going to shy away from that, over the course of that 2 decades, an integrated investment program where my officers can go to ministers through a first and second pass process, through the normal budgeting process, to say we're getting to a recapitalisation point where the capability is going to either become obsolescent or we're going to be out of contract, and we are not confident about a value for money outcome unless we do a full tender. Under the PGPA, which I'm sure this committee is very well aware of, I cannot possibly go out to the market to say, we think we might have a several billion-dollar procurement here. Would you like to tender for it? But I've got no certainty about whether there's funding. Unless the funding model of this department is fundamentally changed, I don't think, Mr Chair, you'll see those numbers change materially in years to come. Your successor will be sitting here in 10 years' time, and my successor will be sitting here in 10 years' time, and that number might be 50%. It might be 51%. It will not change. The funding model is fundamentally deficient. So I either go to government and say, I actually am going to terminate this contract because I'm concerned about value for money and all the other things that you quite rightly are focused on, to which the government then says, OK, but we don't have a detention capability, or we don't have a coastal vessel fleet capability, we don't have a maritime surveillance capability. That is not acceptable, Mr Pizzullo. Get your act together. OK, well then I'm only left with one tool, which is contract variations and extensions. It's a devil's choice.
Well, in responding to that question about the urgency variations, if you could also give some consideration to the data in this procurement report that came out last week, that'd be helpful.
Thank you. We will.
Last time you appeared here, we were discussing one of the reports you just touched on, Report 16 of 2016-17, about failures in procurement and contract management and home affairs of the garrison services in Nauru and Manus Island. Just for the record, for those who might not be familiar with this ancient report, in that, I think I'm the only member of the committee that's been here for that long. In that report, the ANAO found, I'll just read a few quotes, the Department of Immigration and Border Protection's management of procurement activity for garrison support and welfare service at the offshore processing centres in Nauru and Manus Island has fallen well short of effective procurement practice. There were serious and persistent deficiencies in the 3 phases of procurement activity. Of most concern is the Department's management of processes for contract consolidation and open tender. The conduct and outcomes of the tender processes highlight procurement skill and capability gaps amongst departmental personnel at all levels. And then we could have a look at, what was attachment A? Sorry, that was page 14 and 15. Sorry, the recommendations. It was a late night last night reading these. And the grant submissions that have come.
Or rereading it, it sounds like.
Rereading it, yes, indeed, rereading, yes, refreshing one's memory. The recommendations from the Auditor General then were that the Department address as a priority through training and staff selection, significant procurement skill and capability gaps and guidance and a strategic approach, that the Department take practical steps to ensure adherence to the requirements of the resource management framework when undertaking procurements, including the obligation to manage all aspects of a process in accordance with the rules and so on. The Department agreed to those recommendations.
Yes.
Yes, and you also agreed with the committee's...
That was the 2016...
That was, that was the 2016 one.
Yes.
You also agreed with the committee's recommendations for improvement in procurement practices in our 2017 report.
Yes.
You actually doubled down then in assuring the committee that the problems were fixed, and I've got the executive minute here from March 2018, which actually I think I tabled in the Parliament.
Yes, I recall that.
Where you said, Home Affairs ongoing reform program assures that we're ready to meet the challenges and opportunities in our current future operating environments to deliver overall financial management, including procurement, financial strategy, policies, systems, processes. Acknowledge the weaknesses. You've had a full review of the procurement manual and that
Yes.
you're confident that the actions have produced improvements to the processes and human resource capabilities relevant to the recommendations. If the recommendations were properly implemented, though, why are we still discussing problems in contract management and procurement? And it's not the only report between now and then.
Because, either the committee accepts my contention or it doesn't, that absent an ability to recapitalise on a predictable basis, then you're always going to have contract variations and extensions in order to deliver key essential services. There's nothing that I've seen in this report, and I've read it very carefully and I'm preparing for this, that suggests to me that there's any deficiency in terms of delivering and implementing those reforms. And the Chief Operating Officer, Ms Saunders, who's responsible at the deputy level for the procurement function, and the Chief Procurement Officer, a position that I established in 2019 to build on the reforms that you've just described in 2018. In terms of the internal mechanics of delivering better procurement outcomes, the best that we can within the budgets that are afforded to us, I stand by those reforms, and Ms Saunders or Ms Monteroso might wish to add to that answer, but I'm giving this committee clear counsel that we will be having the same discussion next year and in 4 years' time and in 5 years' time and in 10 years' time if recapitalisation is not taken seriously.
It's a strategic point, and I'd also invite you, because we will look at it, you're making a very serious point in the very serious portfolio. If you want to provide a supplementary note for a couple of pages just explaining that our Secretariat can review and examine with the view to...
I'd be very happy to.
With a view to making sure we're precise in any wording or recommendations. So
I'd be delighted.
Thank
you, Mr Chair.
I think that's an invitation which you'd welcome.
I welcome it, but I might, because Ms Saunders and Ms Monteroso run the process day to day, with the implementation of the changes, Ms Monteroso particularly in 2017, to respond to the Audit Committee report of 2017, the changes that I codified in 2018 that the Chair has spoken to, and then we double down further by creating your position as Chief Procurement Officer in, I think, 2019. If it's acceptable to the Chair, could I ask Ms Monteroso to comment for a minute or two on the work that she does?
Sure. So,
Thank you.
Monteroso, as the Secretary stated, the Chief Procurement Officer role was established in 2019, part of sort of a wave of reforms in the procurement and contract management function. One of the first ones, I think, following one of the audit reports that you referred to, Chair, on the regional processing, was implementation of what we call a high-risk, high-value procurement process. Now, that's been in place now for a number of years, and actually when a procurement is determined to be a high-risk, high-value procurement process, an entirely separate wave of governance gets put on top of that, with myself, our Chief Finance Officer, our Chief Risk Officer, and a SES Band 2 from our legal group overseeing the process to make sure that it is compliant with our accountable authority instructions, with the Commonwealth procurement rules, with our delegations. The delegation itself also gets elevated to a SES Band 3. And then we also have an assurance function which comes in at stages of that procurement process to actually make sure that we are doing what we said we were going to do. So that's been in place now for a number of years, and we also, look at the process itself. Is it actually doing what we expect it to do? Are the procurements happening the way that they should? We also have assurance over our contract management as well. We've recently released an entirely new contract management manual, contract management framework, and we have assurance over those as well. So we really try to tackle things from both ends, the procurement side and then from the contract management side. The other things that we do... You
told us in 2018 that you'd reviewed the procurement manual and had updated it all then.
Yeah, I said contract management manual. So we had a procurement manual, we also have a contract management, two very separate documents, obviously, because two ends of the process.
And you're responsible for both?
I'm responsible for both of those.
Yep.
And we also do, if the CPRs are updated, if Department of Finance issues new guidance, it's not a set and forget. We will constantly review our documents. Are they working the way that they are? Are there other audits that we can learn from? If someone's got a best practice thing, well, let's add that into them. So it's not a, 2018 and then we don't look at it again.
I think your initial submission, if I recall, it might have been you, there's a few, but I think it was one of yours that it validated or reinforced the Auditor General's view around the professionalisation of procurement, and it's No,
Yep.
It wouldn't be a surprising rec if we were to make it that it really needs to be formalised back in the job capability framework, because every organisation that gets themselves into
Yep.
trouble in one way or another, whether they do it fast or slow, seems to come to the solution now that you're looking at. The National Capital Authority, the Digital Transformation Authority, the Department of Industry, everyone seems to be going, actually, distributed procurement with thousands of people who don't do it very often is not a very good idea.
We haven't had distributed procurement for a long time, though.
No, and so I'm happy to, sorry,
Yep.
to dig in. There's obviously a lot in this space, to the
Yep.
Secretary's point. We also have now, within my division, we have what we call like a specialist procurement function who will actually lead some of these major procurements. We'll lead the next
So-
immigration detention procurement, the fixed
Yep.
wing. We will actually lead those procurements for the organisation. So that, that's part of the next wave of reform that we've made, and is actually for those particularly complex procurement processes will actually be run out of my division, of course, with the, very close partnership of the capability owner, in this case the Australian Border Force, to help, determine what it is that we need to purchase.
And so would it be fair to say, I've looked at some of the other audit reports, I'll spare you sort of all the reading of quotable quotes, but 2017, fallen well short of effective contract management practice, did not have a detailed view at what it wanted or purchase or standards to apply. Many of the shortcomings persisting in the 2014 contracts indicated that the 2014 process wasn't informed by the lessons from the 2013 contracts, didn't put in place effective mechanisms to manage the contracts, no documentation, assurance processes hadn't occurred in a systematic way, risks weren't managed, no appropriate records, department had not been well placed. Then we go to 2018-19, the Cape Class patrol boat in support service arrangement. The department's administration hadn't fully yet met the contracted performance and availability requirements. Governance arrangements had not provided effective oversight, hadn't aligned with the Department of Home Affairs policy, not included the identification of reporting of in-service service risks. It's almost the same words, isn't it? Not been an effective transition.
We find that we get a lot of templated commentary in those reports, yes. Yeah, there seems to be a predilection to cut and paste. I would agree with that.
I certainly wouldn't, obviously.
I didn't.
I think if there's a
They were not-
familiarity of language, it's because it comes from the rules framework.
Yeah. Is it a systemic problem or just unfortunate coincidences?
I think people who examine documents against documents, they might well come to those views, and in some cases we've contested the conclusions but accepted the recommendations. I think we've got an example of that. But I'd ask the Commissioner bizarrely for all of that, you have Cape Class vessels that sail in the oceans, you have aircraft that fly in the sky, you have helicopters that amazingly fly over the Torres Strait and detect illegal entrants. So it's amazing how you can achieve those outcomes, Commissioner, in the light of those comments by people who work in offices in Canberra. So perhaps
we're doing the uniforms versus bureaucrats bit.
Oh well, I don't know. It's the Commissioner who uses the capability. Right. He would remonstrate with me, I think.
Doesn't the Commissioner work in an office in Canberra?
Well, you get out and about, don't you?
So does the Audit Office.
I may just
spend a lot of time at your building.
They certainly do, and we welcome them all the time. Yeah. But in terms of actual capability delivery, it seems to me that, notwithstanding the point I've made about lack of capital certainty, the capabilities performed to the level that we can get most effectively out of the resources available.
As the capability owner, Chair, I obviously would always want more. But I think that whether it's the Capes, whether it's the Dash 8s, whether it's the helicopters in the Torres Strait, the outcome that we've achieved over a couple of decades now in our civil maritime security space around our borders is actually pretty outstanding, including Operation Sovereign Borders.
On vapours almost.
It's not always easy, and what I would say though is, of course, the people who are out there operating these capabilities do an incredible job, whether it's the pilots, the crews at sea as well. So maintaining the capability relies on, obviously, good procurement and all of those things we've talked about. But the reality is that we've managed to deliver, notwithstanding any challenges, a pretty good operational effect over the last couple of decades in that space.
We'll get back to some of the operational effects in a moment.
Thank you.
From last time we saw you in 2016, you had a very, very long response here, but You said that the department you took over in October 2014 was essentially a hollowed-out crash department. A number of our staff have left because they were burnt out, and so you've replenished your stocks with new leadership.
Yes.
But you'll pursue, and are well along the track, this was in 2016, excellence in corporate governance and having those mechanisms in place. How are you going in terms of achieving corporate governance excellence 6 years on?
Well, in terms of, and of course, since that time, the Department of Immigration and Border Protection, of course, has become the Department of Home Affairs, so we're graced with even more responsibilities at the end of 2017 by Mr Turnbull, so we've built on the base that I described at that time. Yes, the department in October of 2014 had been very severely impacted by the flow of boats that started, of course, during the period 2008-2009. Very difficult work, distressing work, at least 1,200 lives that we can document lost at sea, impacting both the, what was then the Customs and Border Protection Service that I headed, and now the Border Force, and my own staff who worked in the
question
detention.
was about how you're going in terms of achieving excellence in corporate governance.
Correct. So then that turnaround was well in place by 2016, new leadership, the changes to procurement that you already heard about, other changes made, centralising our intelligence functions, a whole range of other reforms that I could happily discuss. Mr Turnbull then, of course, gave us some additional challenges by asking that the department, along with some other functions, mogged or changed by way of machinery of government, come in from other parts of government. Saw the creation of the Department of Home Affairs. The country's been kept safe. Boats have been stopped. With partner agencies, thwarted a number of terrorist attacks. The place attracts, whenever we seek vacancies, the place attracts considerable expressions of interest from people who want to come to a very active, dynamic, real-world department. So I'm very, very comfortable with the fact that, notwithstanding a couple of issues around workplace relations and industrial relations and pay that I'm sure you're about to get to, which I would also like to remedy, and if you've heard me speak about recapitalisation issues in a moment, I'll venture forth on pay issues in a moment. Notwithstanding those difficulties, where we tend to be at the bottom end of the bell curve of pay outcomes, the officers deliver outstanding services in a very professional way. I won't speak for the Border Force, but I'm proud to say that they're technically my employees under the Public Service Act, but I just think that that they deliver for the vapors that we're funded for an outstanding level of service to the community, and Australia is kept safe as a result.
The ANAO's overview in their 22-23 work program, so this current year,
yes.
Identifies, I quote, portfolio risks predominantly relate to ensuring consistent compliance with governance frameworks, contract and procurement management. Specific risks include governance and financial management, which were all the things that we said 6 years ago we were on the way to excellence.
And we'll happily engage with the ANAO as they work through, I think that's the forthcoming program.
It's 22-23, that's this year.
Sorry. So we'll engage with the ANAO and deal with matters that they put before us for examination.
One of the themes emerging from this inquiry is culture, and as we've heard repeatedly, the CPRs are a principles-based framework.
Yes.
And as you yourself told the committee in 2016, the CPRs do have flexibility.
Yes, yes.
I'm sure, as you'd accept, just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. It's ethics in life.
That's a fair observation. I'd agree with that, Mr Chair.
Or in the case of variations because of urgency, that you should have to because an agency didn't plan their work properly, or you're saying government...
Well, I'm not accepting the premise at all. We planned meticulously. I'm just not in a position to give you chapter and verse unless I get... Well, it's difficult because it's confidence of former governments, but I just simply do not accept that contention. I could go through chapter and verse if I was in a position to, without breaching the confidence of the former government, NPPs, budget submissions, risk reports, and the planning artefacts and documents that our strategic area generates. I'm not going to accept the contention that we did not plan whatsoever.
One of the themes emerging clearly through the inquiry, and we've had it from all agencies that have been the subject of these audit reports, is the impact on organisational culture on procurement practices, given there's a lot of flexibility, if your word. The DTA, the NCA, the Department of Industry all had similarly bad audit reports and acknowledged the importance of culture. And as the Auditor-General told our last hearing authority, quote, has to be set from the top, and if you're going to have it make a difference, culture is not just an ephemeral thing, it can be the structures you put in place, how you say something has authority, and then how you act on it. The independent chair of your department's Audit and Risk Committee told us, I think, last week that one of the biggest criticisms of the most recent performance audit, I'd say the latest, but that's my word, the most recent, was that the lack of forward planning. And in that hearing, the former Auditor General of Australia, Ian McPhee, agreed that cultures set by leaders and 80% or more of an organisation's culture comes from the leadership. You told us last time you were here 6 years ago that you inherited a hollowed-out department where staff felt burnt out. Is the culture of the Department of Home Affairs a positive one?
I think it's mixed in some respects. Then I'll get Ms Saunders as the Chief Operating Officer to address those issues. I think in terms of clarity of mission, purpose, conscientiousness of our staff, that's a very mission-driven department. And I think all of the data supports that. Frankly, I candidly wish I could pay my staff more without being required to offset it against key mission capability. I think that there's a wage apartheid that's emerging in the public service through the fragmentation of pay arrangements that has occurred over about a 10 or 15 year period.
I think you're outlining the government's election platform, so that's nice.
I'm sorry?
I think you're outlining some of the criticisms that we've made of that situation.
Well, for me, I'm just taking issue on merit as a practitioner of leading a department. I'm not putting any partisan imputation to it. I have to say that some of that wage disparity predated 2014 because of changes that were made to management arrangements in the 90s, whereby initially with the FMA Act and then coming to being of the PGPA Act, discretion was afforded to agencies, and you're starting to see this disparity start to emerge, not just around wages and conditions, but also in terms of technology and other capabilities, but that's a matter for a different day. And I think it's fair to say, Commissioner, you can speak for the ABF, but I think for issues that more directly connect to conditions, working environment, pay, I'd like to see improvements. That takes resources. In relation to mission commitment, passion, diligence, do I trust my leader, my immediate supervisor? Do I like working my team? I'm very satisfied with those results, but perhaps in terms of the data, Ms Saunders might wish to comment in terms of, I don't want to speak for the ABF, critical part of the department, but they've got a separate identity. I'd ask the Commissioner maybe to comment.
Certainly, Chair, I think they're very similar. So our employees in the Australian Border Force are incredibly committed to the mission. However, we similarly face those problems of competition. So it's a tough job working in the Australian Border Force, protecting the border, running detention centres and those sorts of things. And quite simply, we cannot compete on pay with departments and agencies. So attracting staff into the Australian Border Force isn't our problem. It's keeping them there for a substantial period of time.
I've remonstrated, I won't go into the particulars. I don't think, for instance, that the census technique that the APS uses adequately captures the reality and the dynamism required in what I'd call operational departments. It's not passing strange, and I make no criticism of the departments that tend to be at the top of the pecking order. Canberra-based policy work, really important work. They do really important work, a lot of flexibility in terms of working from home, a lot of ability to have flexible working arrangements. Commissioner, I suspect if your colleagues in the Border Force had a lot of that flexibility, they'd probably have higher job satisfaction.
We've got the very same issues if I talk to Defence, chairing the Defence Committee, intelligence and security agencies. There's many parts of government that are grappling with these things.
So there's almost two public services emerging, and it's policy work's really important. We do policy work. There's if you like policy work which is content heavy, very much tied up in the Canberra process of cab subs and advising government, and then there's, in my case, a circumstance where APS 4s or 5s make life and death decisions in terms of the visa that they grant or don't grant. They can be put into courts. They can be subpoenaed to appear, not a feature of some departments. So if you look at the big delivery departments or agencies like the ATO, ourselves, Services Australia and Defence, there's almost a different way that you've got to think about managing your team, and I think we need to think differently about how we compensate for that, how we reward pay and conditions.
I think you made the point on pay. Pay is one factor in retention or a culture or job satisfaction, but for many public servants, I presume you'd also agree that there's intrinsic motivations, there's quality of management, there's mission, as you say, there's a sense of purpose. And The 2018-19 APS employee census found that it wasn't about, oh, well, there's some departments at the top and that we're not doing as well because of the nature of our work. You ranked last for staff engagement out of 97 departments surveyed, and near last for wellbeing. The census found staff had experienced low morale, poor engagement from management, high levels of bullying and harassment, and that only 25% of staff felt valued for their work, which I can't relate that to feeling a sense of mission and purpose. And you're right, there was high level of support for immediate supervisors, which you acknowledged, but staff were generally highly critical of the senior leadership team. Now, I think, to be fair, one of the reasons for the statement of no confidence or petition that circulated in 2019 calling for you to resign was pay, but the petition called to end years of waste, mismanagement and chaos at Home Affairs.
I don't even recall that submission, that petition. It obviously wasn't. I can
find you a copy.
Well, you might want to send it to me. I don't even recall it. Ms Saunders, do you...
It was a statement of no confidence circulated.
Look, I do recall that occasionally there's industrial mobilisation at the time of wages being discussed, and we have a very healthy
But it's not just wages, because year after year after year after year, you rank last in the culture surveys.
I get it, but who do you think organises the petitions? Ms Saunders, can you recall that...
Conspiracy.
Well, it's not a conspiracy. If I was running the CPSU, that's what I'd do as well.
I haven't spoken to the CPSU.
No, but I'm giving you a counter-interpretation. Ms Saunders, can you remember that census of 4 years ago? I can't recall a petition of that nature, but...
No, I have to go back in detail, but obviously it was a time, obviously there were industrial negotiations underway. There was a range of factors at that point in time.
We were in bargaining, weren't we?
We were in bargaining.
No, of course, yeah.
So, all right, so you're saying that there's developed an apartheid regime over recent years as that gap's grown?
I think there's too many... this is a view that I'm known to hold. I've expressed it in other fora. I think the public service, through a lot of managerialist ideological changes made in the 1990s, has become a much more fragmented body. There's sort of the service delivery, operations, the military wing, the field wing, and then there's other parts. I think wages is just really just a symptom of that. So you chase talent, you see departments that can afford to pay for relatively few numbers of people, then jacking up, for instance, the top of band. So, for instance, the top of an EL2 and the top of an EL1. There's
an unfortunate reality that you're recruiting from a small pond of who will live in Canberra. That's been a reality for a long time.
That's part of it, yes.
If I could, Chair, but quickly on culture, there's a lot of work that we are doing. So I just talked to the Australian Border Force and the Chief Operating Officer might talk more broadly about the department. We've just entered into partnership, for example, with the Human Rights Commission in for about 12 months now, working on better understanding our culture and how to improve our workplaces around the country, however remote they be. And we're a year into that partnership, and that's a 5-year partnership that we're working in. We've I pushed far more of our senior executives into the regions to be much closer to our workforce, to be much closer to the area of operation. So Band 2s have gone into each region, Band 1s have gone out into regions, so we've moved a lot of our staff out of Canberra and leadership to get much closer to our workforce. And I could go on, there's a lot of initiatives that we're doing to address, as you say, to address the feedback from staff.
But the feedback's been the same for 7 years.
And what I'm saying to you is that we're not blind or deaf. We are doing a lot of work right now, including in the department.
But whatever you're doing is not working because it's been 7 years. I mean, from 2014, in the 2 years that DIBP existed as a standalone department and entity, there are unfavourable media reports. The internal Pulse survey then, in January and February, referenced suggestions that you operated like a military-style regime. There was low levels of confidence and trust in leadership. Then in 21, 22, this has gone on year after year after year.
Chair, if I could make an observation coming in as the coup now, for just over a year. Certainly what I've seen is a real commitment by the department over many years to address the cultural challenges that exist, which I think both the Secretary and the Commissioner have well outlined. Obviously we've touched on the issues of wage disparity, work conditions, but this organisation takes on and it has, if I reflect on the last 2 years, for example, COVID, we've been at the front line of COVID. And for our people, that has meant a 24/7 responsibility, which is not the same pressures, workforce pressures and demands that you might see across the APS. So this straight extrapolation of performance...
That's a big call. That is a big call.
Number of operational departments.
I mean, I was in the DFAT crisis centre where they stand up hundreds of people across DFAT, as you would well know, are rostered on 24/7, just like doctors on call, just like many of your staff. We've got the Defence Department that are deployed around the world. We've got the Department of Health managing a pandemic.
Chair, I'm reflecting the feedback from our own people.
Sure.
People in our department, and they're very conscious of the front
But the
line.
other departments don't have the worst culture survey.
You did
They've been at the front
say
line.
that you were unique.
If I could say, we've been at the front line of the COVID response in the last 2 years, and what we see from our people is they're very committed to the mission and the work that Home Affairs has done to contribute to the government's response and to the safe reopening of the international border, for example. So they've responded to that. They've had very positive feedback about how the organisation has supported them through what has been a really challenging time for them as individuals, as teams, as an organisation.
And we've certainly expressed solidarity with those operational and service delivery departments. I'll give you a case study, Mr Hill. The immigration function, well known because of other proceedings both in this committee and estimates. We sought to overhaul the technology to give our staff the kind of tools that they were very keen to have. So the technology in the immigration space, quite dated through a series of decisions, which of course I respect. The immigration function was declined over about a 10-year period from 3,200 people to 2,700 odd people, a reduction of roughly 500. But the volumes, particularly now that COVID's is behind us, volumes are coming back. The morale in that area, in the immigration function, if you've got more work, technology that hasn't kept pace, not the sort of technology, for instance, that you would find in a bank or an insurance company, where you have a whole lot of data fusion, artificial intelligence, machine learning that can help your customer service function. Of course, morale takes a dip. What happens when you put 500 extra FTE and you say to that area, we're going to inject resources? Yes, we've got to deal with the technology issues in due course. There's a pep in their step, and I'm just delighted at the fact that that area's been...
Glide in their slide, to quote Senator Hume. It's one of her phrases.
Okay, I'm not familiar
You're
with that.
preaching to the converted. You know, I've probably been the most vocal critic in the Parliament of the visa processing system.
If you resource areas, you give them a sense of confidence. Yes, there's got to be good leadership from the top. I accept Mr McPhee. I think you referred to Mr McPhee. I think you might have referred to the Auditor General. I absolutely accept you've got to have good leadership from the top. You've got to have empowerment. You've got to have reasonable discretion within clearly set rules. And you've got a resource function. So I'll give you one vignette. When we ran at the direction of the Turnbull government, the visa technology overhaul program, and I know that there was a difference of view between the then opposition because of the private capital, but can we just put that to one side?
Because $92 million was wasted on failed privatisation and $42 million
If we can put the
PowerPoint from
allegation of
BCG.
privatisation to one side, but when we actually saw, and I can tell you this is a lived experience, right? So we had 2 trial teams looking at new technology, very, very leading edge technology, sort of technology though that you would find in a bank, insurance company, travel agent, where visas were being triaged. We need to find nurses for Tasmania, or we need to find welders for Adelaide. When we ran because there was a fly-off between 2 tenderers, which I won't articulate who they were. And
Both mates of the former Prime Minister, why they couldn't conclude a tender. Sorry, Secretary.
I'm not.
Sorry, I'll go back to being the chair.
I'm not convinced that you're interested in what I've got to say.
Chair,
So,
Would you like to continue? I'll be the chair because Ms. Ananda
I do appreciate it.
I am actually interested.
I was going to make thank you so much. I was just going to make quite a targeted point. I know there was a lot of contention, and Ms Keneally ran a campaign to criticise the private capital. I'm not going to that issue. That's a matter for government. But when you visited the teams who were in partnership with the 2 authorised prototype vendors, the enthusiasm, the sense of mission, the sense, wow, if we can get this, I don't have to have 7 dialogue boxes open, I can have IT that supports me to triage my work, I can do some of it from home. The morale, like you'd walk into a work team and it was almost unrecognisable. Now, for reasons that I fully respect, that tender came to, was terminated by the former government. I always respect the decisions taken by government. So if you invest in your staff, if you give them good technology, you give them a good sense of mission and purpose, and yes, they've got to be well-led. Funnily enough, those numbers change. It's really, really strange how that works out.
And Chair, and if I could just note in your earlier comment about there hasn't been an improvement in culture, we all know culture is a work in progress in any department or organisation, but there has been improvement over time, and I think even the most recent census results indicate there's been improvement across the board. It's not as high as we would like. I would love to see that. I'd love to see Home Affairs scoring the top, in the top 10 of the APS. That'd be fabulous, and we aspire to that. But there has been improvement across the board. There has been a concerted effort by the department to invest in our leadership group. There's been a significant investment in terms of addressing the behavioural...
Can you take that on notice and give us an explanation?
But if I could just make one observation, as well as we've just recruited 5,000 people into the department just since beginning early of 2022. So there's been market improvement across the board.
Yep.
So just on taking on that note, Ms Saunders, can you actually provide us perhaps since, how long, maybe the last 5 years, or actually when were those? 7 years, wasn't it?
2014.
Yeah, since 2014. Can you provide us with the results of the surveys? And so we can just see.
Give you the library brief.
Yeah. When's that up to?
Well, here and there.
Okay.
We'll come back to you on notice, and I think there's a consistent set of questions too. I think
That's
that
right.
that
Some
have been
variation over time, but there is some consistent basis. Yes.
Yes.
It's not a facetious point. It does go back to flexibility. It's a point the Audit Office have made to us. I sometimes feel like the goldfish going around in the bowl, that departmental culture shapes that sense of confidence to speak up. It shapes retention, being able to hold a contract manager for more than 6 or 12 months, and they're not frontline jobs. They're not out there doing all that work that you described before. And the dominant culture, when you have years of reports of a culture of bullying and harassment and domineering behaviour, then that does impact retention and it does impact morale.
I just want to test. I'm not sure what data is being referred to there, but
I'm quoting from advice I've got from the library, extracting information about the survey. But anyway, you're very welcome to respond, and we'll take it.
And on speaking up, we're the only department that's fully under the Standing Royal Commission for Integrity. We have so been as a function of the merger of immigration and customs. So agriculture is in a similar position, except the integrity function, the Royal Commission function sits only over a particular part.
Yep.
There is, I can assure you, Mr Hill, because all the referrals come to me, there is no inhibition of people speaking up, calling out, in some cases, fraudulent and indeed criminal behaviour, reporting it, and they feel well protected in doing so. At any one time, for a workforce of 14,000 people, inclusive of the uniform wing, we have about 100 or so on-foot matters with the ACLI Commissioner. Obviously that will now transition into the new Anti-Corruption Commission. I've detected nothing but a willingness to show courage, to come forward and say, no, that's wrong. That person's accessing a system and potentially passing it on to criminal elements. If the department that I lead, along with the Commissioner, was in fact not through these pulse surveys or these, occasional ticker box. So if it was actually running the way you've described, people would be cowered by their managers, and we'd actually have visas being sold for corrupt purposes. We'd have custom systems being penetrated by insiders passing it on to bikies. Instead, what we have are courageous staff coming forward saying, no, that's wrong, and those matters are being referred to a standing Royal Commission in the form of ACLI. I'm very proud of the fact that we've got strong practices around whistleblowing and integrity protection, and every organisation is going to have its bad apples, but to have 14,000 people doing their job diligently and about 100 cases, the numbers do vary, that have been looked at, I think is outstanding in terms of the integrity of the staff.
I want to acknowledge that. I've known you for over 20 years, and personally I like you. I think you're a brilliant man, and I have absolutely no doubt whatsoever in your commitment to integrity and combating fraud, but they're not the issues that we're talking about of concern here.
And we'll look at the data around other staff responses. I do want to see that time series that Senator Reynolds has asked for, and sure. I'll look at that answer myself very carefully.
I might. There is a bit on contract management. I suspect we're probably not going to get very far on that because the audit report has one view and you've expressed your view.
Sorry, is that on civil maritime?
On the civil maritime. I mean, I think we've done procurement, history and culture. The Auditor General's contention, when you look at it, is that the contracted services haven't been adequately delivered. that we've never achieved the hours in any given year, 7.7% average shortfall, 11% of planned missions cancelled or aborted, a further 25% only partially completed, aircrew requirements never met, the number of aircrew each month averaged 33% down. The ANAO estimates Home Affairs may have paid $87 million in monthly service charges for crew numbers it didn't receive.
Is this from the audit report?
Yep, that's all from the audit report.
Yes, sorry.
Yep.
Could I ask the Commissioner?
Like they're all facts according to the
And
audit
I'll take
office.
some other facts. The overall contract performance, whether we like it or not, it was bound into the contract in 2008, doesn't hold the contractor to account in the performance framework for how many crew, how many hours. It's based on dispatch reliability, which is are they on time in terms of the mission, and do they have a full crew complement, and mission completion, which is against the planned area of coverage. In fact, between January 2008 and 22, the contract target performance or performance target was met 159 times. It was below only 21 times, and 8 of those are still being confirmed. So I would accept, of course, that the number of crew is important, and I would accept, of course, that we've got ceilings and floors in relation to targeted flying hours. In relation to missions not being completed as well, this is something that the report doesn't really go into, is that most of our missions are flown in the tropics, and we have aircraft going into and out of Christmas Island and those sorts of places. Fuel, range, those sorts of things, restrictions, weather, atmospherics, all of these things affect whether or not a mission can actually take place in the first place or whether it can be completed as planned. So there is in this area of operation a lot of variability. However, what I would say is this: Maritime Border Command, who are they're the joint task force that sit in the Australian Border Force who undertake these missions, have a planning team that are world class. They are comprised of defence, Border Force, a range of very expert planners, and all of our missions are planned meticulously. And when you look at in terms of the overall contract performance metrics, by and large it's been met. When you look at the outcomes, Operation Sovereign Borders, illegal fishing, all of the threat vectors that we deal, we've performed very well, and the crew themselves do an amazing job. There are some observations in the report that I do take issue with. So, for example, this fixation on night missions. The reality is that Maritime Border Command prefer their missions to be flown by day because people can actually see, and that's really important. If you get a contact on a radar, then you want to go in and have a look, and so it's simply there in the contract for use if we need it. But Maritime Border Command and the planners, who are expert, as I've said, by and large don't need it and don't want it flown at night. And so, there is an element here of we might all like, and we've agreed with the recommendations for the future, to change the way that contract performance is managed in future contracts. I would accept that. But we have what we have here, and in terms of air crews, there are a whole lot of issues there, and I would agree that there's been less than we would like. We're unable to take action against the contractor in terms of abatements because it's not part of the overall contract performance framework. However, through
part of the future contract.
Through COVID-19, there are significant challenges, and I'll just give you a very sort of matter-of-fact explanation. So if I could, Chair, if I could. So through COVID-19, of course, the aviation industry in particular has gone through. Sorry, I'm just going to pull you up there because COVID-19 is after this audit report. I think somewhat amusingly, you made the observation or protestation that the audit report's looking in the rear-view mirror.
Competition for pilots, Senator. Chair. Competition for pilots with what was Cobham, now Leidos, with Qantas or whoever it is, has been an issue. Moreover, what wasn't envisaged in 2008 was the volume of our operations that were going to be over the Indian Ocean territories. Sure. And we are having to fly significant volumes and percentages of our missions over the Indian Ocean territories. That causes a strain on pilots and crews. A lot of them come from the East Coast and their families are there. And this is an issue that we are constantly in dialogue with the contractor about. And we are going to continue to fly a lot of missions over the Indian Ocean territories. But the contract wasn't set up for that. And if you look at the bases that we have, they're not geared up for that. We don't have a base on Christmas Island to fly from. And
ideally, if I can assist, Commissioner, once we got sovereign borders settled and the boat stopped, To be candid, my view, I'm not expressing government policy, it's not my job to. We should have reset the contract when we first proposed it in about 2014, 2015. We started doing the planning in 16. Even, I will accept this criticism on the part of the department, probably should have gone harder with government in 14 or 15. I think OSB's success was probably the point at which we should have done a reset and thought, hang on, this contract's not fit for purpose. It's kind of a close inshore contract where you're flying out from Darwin and Cairns and sweeping around sort of closer littoral waters. If the boats ever start again, we need to think about a contract that throws the screen further out, including that very significant operating point out of Christmas Island and Cocos. And we should have probably, and this is on the department as much as not, giving adequate advice to government. But once we started giving the advice, it's then government that's need to take ownership
I'll hand over
of decisions.
to the Deputy Chair, but so in essence, the reflection there is you should have gone harder in trying to convince Scott Morrison and Peter Dutton to re-tender.
Well, the government of the day.
Well, they were your ministers.
Well, yeah. Well, I work for the government. Doesn't matter what colour they are.
And Prime Minister employs you.
We work for the government of the day.
Indeed. Deputy Chair.
Thank you very much. And I've listened with great interest and occasional bemusement, Secretary, in terms of some of the things you've said. I preface my questions with a comment, first of all, is that in Parliament there is no greater supporter for the ABF staff and admiration for the work that your people do, Commissioner and Deputy Commissioner. They do extraordinary work in challenging circumstances, and it is a tight job market, and we do ask extraordinary things of them.
Thank you.
So, I was your minister briefly, and also in defence, and two very operational portfolios. So,
yep.
We owe your people the best possible support and service.
Thank you.
And this is where I come to, is reading these reports. And as you know, I've had the benefit of sitting in NSC, which of course I won't talk about the specifics of, and seeing how different departments present. I've got to say, reading these reports, I cannot find any other way to describe it, Secretary, is endemic underperformance in terms of your contract management on behalf of the capability for Australian Border Force. It is not just in the fixed-wing aircraft for aerial surveillance, Cape class, and we've had other contracts as well. Now, listening to your defence, I'm quite surprised that it's all previous ministers' faults. It's the ANAO's report. I mean, I don't know whether you ever thought, and perhaps this is my first question, is that if you're getting templated, as you describe it, audit reports year after year from the ANAO, that they're not just cut and pasting from previous reports. There are actually issues there that need to be addressed. Beyond saying the right things, when you come before when you respond to the ANAO and also come before this committee.
Well, all I can...
Have you ever thought that it might be true?
I've certainly accepted that there were changes that were needed where, even if you accept that the conclusions, the analysis that gets you to the point of a conclusion might be something that's contested or contestable, that the recommendation about having best practice procurement, best practice contract management can be accepted. And all I can say, and Mr Hill previously said that I was just uttering words, and I was surprised that, I don't know how else I can communicate it. The changes briefed to the ANAO, the changes briefed to this committee, the establishment of Ms Monteroso's position, the progressive changes from 2017, the putting in place of the scrutiny of high-value, high-risk contracts in 2018, the creation of the Chief Procurement Officer position, have all led us to a point where we've got greater visibility of contract management issues, procurement issues. Yes, the market sweep that Mr Hill spoke about.
We'll come back to that.
Yes, yeah, not necessarily best practice, but just to make sure that we're not missing a chance to do anything other than extended, was generated by the scrutiny that team was able to support me in providing.
So as... I asked a pretty simple question. Do you see, as Secretary, that you are accountable for this endemic underperformance over many years?
I'm accountable for the performance of the department. I'm not going to accept the characterisation of endemic underperformance. We don't necessarily agree with the conclusions that the ANAO sometimes get to, but we agree, because it's just common sense often, that the best practice that they recommend is what should happen anyway. So we implement the best practice, but you've also heard from the Commissioner, he doesn't accept certain analytical conclusions
So you don't
either.
agree. So you don't agree with the ANAO findings, yet you agree that you need to make some significant changes to do some significant improvements. But there's no problem to start with, and they got their audits wrong, but you're still making these changes anyway.
Well, you just heard the Commissioner expound at length on how performance has actually been achieved, notwithstanding the fact that the ANAO can only look at the documents that they look at, and they only can
But
attest against
Secretary,
those documents.
I was very, very specifically said I'm not in any way reflecting on the performance of the Australian Border Force. Just imagine if you hadn't had endemic contracting issues with your Cape class, with the aircraft, what more they could have done if they'd actually had better contracts, because both of you have said that the contracts that you went into, that you varied 40 times, were under-delivering and underperforming. So if the Cape classes were actually more available and also aircraft, what more could they have done? And that is the opportunity cost that your poor contracting has meant for our border forces.
I don't accept the contention whatsoever, Senator. And
so just on that, so are you saying the figures in these audit reports year after year in terms of the hours that were not delivered, in terms of the non-availability of your Cape class vessels over the years, so are you saying that's actually not true?
No, the figures are agreed, but it's the Commissioner is responsible for the mission outcome.
Mr. Pizzullo. So
and he's achieving his mission.
If your contracts are not living up to what you're supposed to be delivering for the Australian Border Force, and they're not delivering the hours and the capability that the taxpayer is paying for, how is that not an opportunity cost in terms of what the ABF could have been doing for Australia with the money that we've paid?
Well, I just referred to the Commissioner's
1.5 billion, in fact, just for these aircraft.
Commissioner, you responded earlier, did you not?
What I would say, Senator, is obviously from an outcomes point of view that let's take the Cape class. I think there was 1 year where the number of patrol days didn't increase, and I think at the time we explained that was due to deep level maintenance that was required in the 5-year window. And certainly in the last 3 years we've increased year on year the number of patrol days for the Cape class fleet, which I'm delighted about. Of course, notwithstanding COVID, which had a significant impact, as you'd appreciate, on our crew and crew availability and those sorts of things. We couldn't get crew, for example, out of Western Australia without them having to go into 2 weeks quarantine when they went back after their 4-week shift. So I'm actually, could we get more out of the Capes? We'd like to try, but we do push the Capes much harder and far further than was envisaged. I'm aware of this because I spoke to the first Commander
That's why
Maritime
Defence
Border
went
Command
with
in
enhanced
2015.
Cape class
We do push them hard.
to deal with that issue.
Yeah, we do push them hard, and we are increasing year on year the number of patrol days.
So we've got a circumstance in front of us that, whether the Secretary doesn't agree with the term endemic underperformance, but I think, as the Chair has said, there's been many years of adverse findings by the ANAO, which you have agreed and accepted, not everything, but these things keep happening. And as the Commissioner of the ABF has said, is that through defective contracts. Now, Home Affairs has done 40 variations to this contract.
Before the $1 billion one.
Before the $1 billion one. So can I just ask then, as the Chair has said, so in relation to market sweeps, so you did it, 2 months before this $1 billion contract was...
As the final market examination, yeah.
Okay.
There've been previous ones.
So how many market sweeps, what is the routine of doing market sweeps? Because obviously technology has significantly changed over the years. So you said you wanted like with like, but technology has changed in terms of what Defence and other intelligence agencies use. So first of all, why did you insist on like for like? And what is the routine for doing market sweeps more regularly? We'll come to your assertions about how you're funded and the IIP or lack of the IIP. We'll come to that later. But how did you go through that process year on year doing market sweeps to find out what technology was available and how you're going to meet that border force effect, the maritime surveillance that you needed?
So initially it wasn't a like-for-like sweep, and Ms Monterosa will need to remind me, the previous government funded, it might have been 16, 17 or 17, 18, I'll have to just check the facts, under Mr Dutton, a comprehensive view of technology. This was announced. In fact, I was asked at length on many occasions by the then opposition about how that process was going, and that was designed to look at uninhabited vehicles, satellites, all forms of technology. So we were funded to do a market examination of technologies.
How much was that?
12 or 14 million. The future maritime
And what year was that?
Mr Dutton announced it in 2017 or 2018. The future maritime surveillance concept. Colleagues, we'll have to come back to you on detail.
No, I can, Secretary.
It's either 17 or 18. When was it?
29th of October 2018, Minister launched the FMSC project. Industry and the department issued an RFI via us tender then.
Okay.
So
was this sweep, this comprehensive review, was that something that you pushed up to the minister, or was
Yes.
that something? Okay, so
well, and Mr Dutton championed it, and I remain eternally grateful for that. He was willing to have a crack, if I can use that term, in the NSC to say, look, we need to start looking at what technologies are out there.
So this was a departmental initiative.
Well, it's the government. It's the government.
So, but it didn't come down initially. So this was you doing your job, responsible for the contracting for the equipment for.
I think that's a fair way to put it. I mean, in the end, it's the minister's decision as to what he takes to, as you well know, to his cabinet colleagues, and then obviously you go through a budget process. You have to convince ERC.
Yep, I know how the process works well, thanks, Secretary.
Quite.
So you did that sweep and have a look at all range of technologies.
Yes.
So you were looking at an effects-based outcome.
Yes, irrespective
for
of
ABF.
platform. Yes, yep. So that was examined. I think I just need to be cautious here because we have given evidence and I don't want to contradict, and we'll come back to your notice. We got the results in. It basically says, yes, in years to come, there will be technologies, particularly in the uninhabited space. In fact, I think even balloons might have come up, which have had some recent notoriety. There will be capabilities and technologies that will, if you like, give you more persistent eyes-on surveillance in the broad area. I think from memory, and Ms Saunders, we'll just need to take this on notice because I've given evidence on this before and I don't wish to contradict myself.
No, I'm happy if you want to take that on notice.
I think basically the result of the decision taken by what would then have been the Morrison government to do a sort of a technology sweep. I'll call it a technology sweep under the Future Maritime Surveillance Capability Construct said. You need a capacity to do broad area surveillance. You'd be familiar with that from your defence days, Senator Reynolds. And then you still need some focal point capability because you need to get to the vessel to see if it's fishing, if it's got a line over, and the Commissioner spoke earlier about daytime operations, for instance. And there frankly are technologies that are coming down the way where in 5, 10, 15 years' time it might well be that we don't have manned aircraft or inhabited aircraft, yes.
So you did that in October 18.
Subsequent to October 18.
So that was commissioned in October 20.
Yes.
When did you... So what was the conclusion of that in terms of how you got to the point where you just wanted fixed wing like for the future contract?
Because when we came back, we weren't funded to do a recapitalisation.
No, that wasn't my question, Mr. Pizzullo, and I said I'd come back to...
The two things are intrinsic.
No, Mr. Pizzullo, I'll come back to that because I've got more questions in relation to that, as you, I'm sure, would imagine. So you did that sweep. So before you get to the cost, did you come to the conclusion? How did you come from that effects-based sweep, looking at different technologies and their current state of maturity and availability and suitability?
Yep.
So how did you, at what point from that did you get to, we're going to recommend fixed wing, extension of fixed wing rather than starting to introduce another mix of technologies?
Understood. We'll need to just check, as I said, I've given evidence in other committees and we've also provided answers to other committees, so I'll just need to check I would hate to be inconsistent with other evidence. Let's say, for the sake of argument today, and we'll correct this obviously as required,
Thank you.
that let's say it took 12 months. It might have taken a little bit longer than that. Very comprehensive project out at Molonglo, as I recall it. They were in your headquarters, from what I recall, Commissioner. Let's say it took 12 months. So you get to the back end of 2019, possibly the start of 2020, but we'll come back to you if that evidence is in error. Essentially, and I'm going to summarise it in colloquial terms, I'll have to remind myself of what the report said. The report obviously came to the Commissioner and I. Look, down the track, yes, there will be technologies that move away from essentially propeller-driven fixed-wing aircraft that are very capable, you know, for their age and time, with a massive radar essentially sitting under the radar.
You don't have to go through the technology. I think we've covered that,
and so at some point,
I do have some understanding of the technological
indeed, and so at some point you will be in a position, subject to capital investment and all the rest of it, to have a combined sort of fleet, largely of uninhabited, long-range uninhabited. So we were very...
No, I get that. But the question is, at what point? So if you could perhaps take on... So one for time and two for accuracy.
Yes.
If you could take on notice when that had concluded and when you'd done your analysis.
Understood.
And what your capability analysis was of what was required.
So I'm going to say, Senator, and we'll come back to you on notice, that I'm going to say early 20, but we will correct that.
Okay.
We then go back to government to say, here's what the future might look like, and here's what we need in the immediate instance to support Operation Sovereign Borders.
Okay.
So I'm going to say early 20.
Presumably, well, I don't want to speculate, but, and maybe this is a question from the Commissioner, was it your assessment as the capability user that you needed so many years of fixed wing, or were there some other technologies or available systems in other agencies that you could leverage off?
My assessment was, Senator, that we were unlikely to acquire new technology, and we'll find out why, by the end of this contract, and my advice to the Secretary was we will need to extend, otherwise we will have a capability gap. And that was my biggest concern.
And indeed, I was very reluctant to extend.
Yeah.
Okay. So that was beginning of 2020, roughly, but you'll provide the dates.
We will
Sometime in
confirm.
2020.
We will confirm.
So
sorry, Senator,
are you now looking...
I just want to be clear so I'm not misleading the committee. What we'll come back to is on the end point of what's called the Future Maritime Surveillance Concept, the FMSC, so I want to be very precise. I think that concluded in the first or second quarter of 2020, and then the analysis was done and recommendations provided to government. If that evidence is in error, I will correct it as soon as possible.
Okay. So your assessment at the beginning of 2020 let's say, thereabouts, was that fixed wing were the only option in the short term.
In the very near term.
In the very near term.
Yeah. Yes.
So you've got the contract to 2028 with the option to bring it back for fixed wing. So what are you doing now in terms of the outcome of that review? Are you now actively looking and doing further market sweeps?
No.
For new technologies?
No, because it goes back to the very starting point that I started with Mr Hill. I would have, other than keeping a watching brief, I mean, we've got a team that looks at technology just generally, I mean, just like Defence have. But in terms of authority to approach the market, I'm in the process of going through a governmental process, which I'm not really going to be in a position to particularise, where I've given certain advice to Minister O'Neill as the responsible minister as to what options she might wish to consider. We do have a bit of runway now, if I can use that term, because on my decision, not hers and not Ms Andrews or Mr Dutton's, on my decision, given the devil's choice that I've described to this committee, I've put some runway out or some buffer out to 31 December 27. Yep. So government's got some coverage or some certainty, and the contractors provided to us an assurance that through spare parts and remediation they'll keep flying for, what is that? That's four and a half years. So
is it just spare parts or remediation? Because I thought the questions on notice talk about upgrades and technology which we're paying for.
It was a replacement, Chair, of the information management system.
We're basically getting like half a new plane.
The radar.
Well, a refurbished.
The refurbished. The airframes are the same. It was the surveillance equipment, the communications equipment, if I can call it that, within the airplane.
But the radar, for instance, is not swapped out.
So this then leads us back. So this then leads us back to your point, which is a little interesting in terms of I guess it's akin to a chicken and egg. Well, you're not putting ideas or suggestions forward because you haven't got the money. But if you're not putting those proposals forward for NSC consideration
sorry,
to approve.
I apologise if I perhaps misled. We've got a very clear sequence of chicken and egg. We're in a position where a government that's still, within its first 12 months has asked us to, examine all capability issues, and as you can imagine, and there's other contracts, and the detention contract that was mentioned earlier. There's the helicopter capability in the Torres Strait. So we run, if you like, to use a concept that you'd be very familiar with as a former Defence Minister, kind of a mini capability plan process. The difference being that every capability recapitalisation decision has to be put forward under the no offsets rule as a sort of a one-off transaction to government, and I've expressed the view that isn't, in my view, optimal. But to suggest that we're not advising the Minister that there's a capability issue that will loom, so you get to the end of 27, we'll be in the same loop unless something is done much earlier. So, we've now got a buffer to remediate that.
Okay, so here's where I'm now very confused with your answer, is you were saying that all of these problems with contract management over extended period of time in relation to the CMS and other contracts, but we're talking about the CMS contract now, is that you couldn't progress this any earlier, you couldn't do the market sweeps or anything else any earlier because you didn't have budget approval for the capital expenditure.
I might have inadvertently misled. I didn't, when Mr Hill started, when we had that earlier exchange, that was really about procurement. Contract management is a discipline that follows, of course, procurement.
But Mr Pizzullo, you can't have it both ways. What goes into the contract, which is your people, has led to suboptimal outcomes for the Australian Border Force. And we've heard that, and the Commissioner said that the contract wasn't good enough to be able to get better performance out of the contractors.
Did you ever, in those 40 variations, seek to change the performance management framework that's flawed?
There were some variations. I'll either ask Mr.
The audit report says one variation actually made it weaker and made it harder to enforce against the contractor.
I'm not sure that we accepted that contention.
Can I just ask the audit office about that?
There was a change in December 2007 that amended the liquidated damages regime.
2007?
Yes.
2007. And again, I just clarify that the overall contract performance metrics were agreed in the regional contract in 2008, I think it was.
Right. Okay, the liquidated damage, that'd be the contract outset. But through any of the sort of substantive variations over years, did you seek to change the performance management framework?
Let's check with either principally Border Force. What about abatements? What about
abatements? So abatements have certainly been issued under the overall.
No, but have we varied? Have we varied as part of the? I don't believe
we've varied it. Whether we've sought to vary it, I'd have to take on notice in all that time.
So, Secretary, perhaps if you're saying that I've misunderstood your opening comments, and I think we'll go back and check on Hansard, but to me you were very clear that the blame didn't reside with you, with the problems endemic or whatever you describe them with this contract. It was actually because the government hadn't provided you with capital funding, so you were forced into this last-minute contract.
Well, you're characterising my evidence. We can all go back and read it. I think what I said was that best practice, whether you're in BHP, defence or running support efforts for the Border Force, is to have a integrated investment plan that then allows you to have funding certainty. It then allows you to recruit staff who are permanent, just like defence, who are permanently there as capability development managers.
No, we don't need to re-go through that. But
well, that's what I said.
The Hansard will show, and I did write it down, that it was you weren't able to do this contract properly. That's my words now. Because you had recurrent funding, but you didn't have sufficient capital funding.
That's
pre-approved, basically.
Well, Capital Plus. You will recall the integrated investment program is not just about capital funding. It's about having a staff on board who provide material, capability development, capability assessment, tender evaluation. As your money runs out, you let those staff go.
thanks for that lesson again, but we here understand that process more than most. So, did you work at any point with Prime Minister and Cabinet, with Department of Finance, to put together an IIP model to
Yes.
put to government and NSC?
Yes.
Okay. And so you put that...
Yes.
Okay. When did you put that forward?
I'll need to consider carefully how I respond, because that would be the subject of
Yes.
Cabinet deliberations, but yes.
Okay. So are you looking...
I have direct personal knowledge of both discussions with then Prime Ministers and then Ministers, heads of PM&C, yes.
And can I just check, that's a broader issue than this contract you're putting
We
to
run a
us?
small Navy, we run a small Air Force,
Yep.
we run something that looks like a custodial. It's not a prison system, but it's a custodial detention system. This is not best practice.
But you are responsible, so again, so without any... So just coming back to my first question.
Yes.
Are you the accountable official for these contractual problems?
I'm the accountable official, full stop.
Yes.
We're going to have a debate or a contest about whether they're deficient, endemic, ongoing, episodic,
Systemic.
We can have any adjective thrown around, but yes, I'm the accountable officer,
Thank you.
without any doubt.
Thank you, Chair.
Since the Department of Home Affairs was created and you received many additional responsibilities, how many of your senior leadership team have been in place consistently?
Ms Saunders might be able to address that. It has going on to 6 years now, so typically in the most senior leadership positions, probably over a 6-year period, there would have been an evolution of 1 or 2, maybe 3 officers. But December 17, we've just gone past December 22, so that's 5 years and a piece. So most of the senior leaders have gone through 1 or 2 evolutions, except for me.
I'm just trying to understand whether the common factor is indeed you.
Well, this is an audit committee. I'm not sure what remit it has otherwise, but I mean, you can.
We've got a very broad mandate around public administration. We've got the PGPA Act.
Yep.
We've got anything to do with procurement, cultures, part of procurement, cultures set by leaders. The only consistent factor through 7 or 8 years of audit reports is you, as Secretary.
Well, you can take the audit view, or you can take the fact that the boats have been stopped, the country's safe. We haven't had the incidents that we've been set up to thwart. If there's a question of confidence...
Well, if we're going to random outcomes, I could tell you there were over 1 million visas applications backlogged that causes untold human misery and economic carnage, including 95% of the work that comes through my electorate.
Well, is a random outcome.
Well, if we're just sort of mentioning things that your department does, we could note the fact that the overwhelming majority of the blockages across every appeal and review system in the Commonwealth is due to the Department of Home Affairs' backlogs, but that's probably a broader discussion. We could have it.
Well, I'm delighted that the government last year gave us 500 FTE to deal with those backlogs, because as I said, it was a pity that the immigration function was hollowed out from the extent of 3,200 FTE being reduced to 2,700. I'd prefer actually to have a combination of both human injection, like FTE injection, plus new technology, but thwarted regrettably in a couple of instances.
I'm 100% on board with you regarding the need to employ more human beings to process visas, because it's what my staff...
And preferably human beings
day.
with better computers.
Indeed. As the former Minister for Immigration, I think I was your most frequent correspondent, your favourite pen pal.
And I should acknowledge Mr Coleman's presence. He was a great champion of and supporter of some of the reforms that I've been alluding to in terms of technology, and thank you, Mr Coleman, for your...
We'll put that on your CV if the redistribution goes badly. Dr Anandaraja?
Yeah, Mr Pizzullo, I have 2 questions. I guess I'm just really concerned that, although your outcomes are excellent in keeping the boats away and so on, I think there's a risk here that we have a lack of competition now in the market, and this lack of dynamism is a risk to us going forward. And I just want to know to what extent have these, I guess, suboptimal processes over the last 2 decades led to this lack of dynamism in the market?
I think,
And what would it take now to fix that, so that we see an emergence of medium to small operators, not just one monopoly
Understood.
player?
I think the experts, and I'm certainly no expert in terms of global aviation services outside of, these are highly specialised services, but the observation I would make as both a long-standing official in the Defence Department and then across to Customs, Border Protection, then Immigration and Home Affairs, is that probably, if I can use this term just in the interest of time, privatised specialist capability providers did not largely exist prior to, let's say, 9/11. I'm not saying it's completely causally connected with 9/11, but certainly with the outsourcing of a lot of services like logistics, surveillance, transportation, aviation services, there is a different kind of market that's emerged in the last 2 decades. It's certainly not as deep and as agile or as capable as, say, the aviation services for, say, civilian, passenger transport, because it's a deeper business. Notwithstanding COVID, you get more throughput, you get the ability for airlines.
I guess what I'm getting at is, how can our processes or your processes be improved to foster greater competition?
I don't know that Australia's purchasing power is going to swing that factor sufficiently, because even though Australia's got a very large landmass with a huge ocean around it, relatively small population, I'm not sure that you're going to generate a global aviation market in what is a highly specialised aviation field. Now, when we go out, hopefully, for a proper, fully tendered procurement, not a market sweep, not a RFI, but a proper tender. Let's see who's out there. So there are a lot of airframes out there. Some of those airframes can be adapted with, radars being bolted on. In some cases, to go to Senator Reynolds' questions earlier, in some cases people are moving away from inhabited aircraft. So let's see, hopefully this side of December 27, not in my gift, let's see what the global market can throw up. I'm not saying that an Australian entity wouldn't be competitive. They might be a subordinate or a subsidiary of a global capability. Some of this did arise...
Does it have to be one company that provides it?
Possibly not, no.
Can you not have multiple players?
You could have systems integrators. You could have, one company that might specialise in surface drones, drones that sort of patrol around oil rigs and the like. You might have other companies that provide rotary wing. You might have someone else who can provide low-flying satellites. Those satellites constellations
Leos,
are getting, the Leos are getting thick. They're thicker and thicker. They're more persistent. Balloons are a thing, tethered or otherwise. They've been a bit notorious in recent times.
I take your point. I think there's a concern. There's a huge risk for our country going forward with one monopoly player.
And certainly as the capability owner, if you like, I'm agnostic. I think that as we go to more sort of layers in terms of our security surveillance, rely on Dash 8s, we rely on other technologies, then I think it opens up the opportunity.
I'm just mindful of seeing you looking at the clock, and I do know you have very serious responsibilities, so I'm just checking. We are going to finish.
This is a very senior committee. I'm happy to be here all day.
Okay, can I ask one more question, Chair?
This is a very important committee of the Parliament. I could set aside my whole day if
you
required.
Also have ministers and staff and other things in your life.
No, this is a very important committee.
So my last question. Sorry.
Perhaps I shouldn't wait 6 years to come back next time. So.
Glad you're enjoying yourself. My last question relating to this integrated investment program that you've been advocating for. There's obviously some synergies here with Defence. Defence,
yes.
Do similar things. They have hardware, they have capability, etc. Is there any possibility of these two mega departments working together?
We've looked at that, and indeed I'll need to check the record as to how much evidence I've given on this, but I have given some evidence. So I've been asked in other committees about a report that David Peever did into precisely this issue about the synergy that might arise, and certainly a number of former ministers were very interested in precisely that synergy. I'm interested in it as well. I've had discussions with both the current CDF and possibly the former CDF, I can't quite recall now. Certainly the current secretary, he's been in his job for quite a while. As the Commissioner and I have looked at that, it obviously would turn on a couple of things. One is there's still the PGPA question, so who actually is accountable to committees such as this for the delivery of the effect? Point one. There's the operational accountability, because in the end it's the Commissioner who has to front the PM and other ministers about am I patrolling the ocean? Am I flying over it? Why did that thing happen at sea? But given the depth that you find in defence, very significant depth, because they have an integrated, and it's just the nature of defence, they have capability development experts, they have capability acquisition experts, they have people who understand in-depth markets such as satellites, uninhabited vehicles, etc. I think there's tremendous synergy. It has been looked at under the direction
Would you like us to re-look at it or revisit that?
Well, it's a matter, in the end, it's a government matter about machinery of government and who delivers what effects, but it is something that we've gone through before. Yeah. I personally, I'm not here to express opinions, but I think we could make that work.
Yeah.
There would be questions of accountability, because if you're the capability manager, say, for the combat fleet, do you have fully on mind what the Commissioner needs by way of, say, Cape Class and beyond?
I guess I'm asking whether Defence could assist with procurement and then you manage operations and all that sort of capability.
I think they could. We've looked at that model, and it's not a model that has been advanced to government decision, but it is a model that's been looked at.
Reinventing the wheel and having an in-house service, which may or may not be sustainable.
That's a very, very sharp question, I think, and it'd be worth reflecting on in our report. I think the Department of the Environment and their icebreaker could well have reflected on that as well.
Yes.
Because they procure ships. That's what Defence do. Lots of it.
I'm done. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Secretary, everyone, for being here. So look, just to focus on the future. So market sweeps, is there anything prohibiting a market sweep from being conducted at any time?
No. I can inform myself as the PGPA authority, and using public resources for that purpose is fine. The issue, Mr Coleman, would be the extent to which you lead the market to believe, because people have to, respond, they have to devote a bit of effort, that there's something in the offing. So you'd have to balance I'd want more than a brochure. Don't send me a pamphlet, but I'd need you to do some work. But in good faith, what is it doing other than informing into my mind something that I need to think about between now and the end of December 27?
Yeah, but given the immense amounts of money involved in these contracts and the limited number of parties who would be bidding for them, I would think they would be very responsive to those sorts of requests. It would be very foolish of them not to be. So
that's a fair point.
Isn't the logical thing to do to say, okay, we've got a 5-year contract.
Yep.
We're going to do a market sweep very early in the process, like after, 2 years or some, quite early. Based on that, we're going to start the procurement process very early to allow plenty of time for, negotiations, whatever. So I'll just pause there. So is there anything? I mean, it sounds very simple, but what am I missing? How would we do that?
I would couch it slightly differently, and it goes to some of the points in the exchange with Senator Reynolds a moment ago. That's technically not a procurement. It's, if you will, a pre-procurement activity. It's a planning activity, and indeed we've got under both the ABF in terms of their requirements. So they advise me on requirements. Then we have our procurement assurance and procurement teams under Ms Monteroso. We can do that at any time. In fact, there's some work underway. I alluded to this earlier when I was speaking to Senator Reynolds about the fact that I'm giving the Minister advice. I wouldn't define that as procurement, because procurement's got a particular meaning within the government procurement rules. It's about going to market in good faith to say, look, we're interested in something. Typically, you would do that by way of an expression of interest or a request for information, or otherwise known as an RFI. I'd be very cautious until I settle with this government, the Labor government, not so much their appetite, because, look, Australia's a maritime nation. It's going to need some kind of surveillance capability. Now, whether it's defence or whether it's some other modality, I'm sure the Minister, she's got a lot on her plate, but she, prioritises her work, and she'll at some point give me a steer as to what her policy appetite is. At some point, whether it's in the next 6 months or 12 months, I don't want to be precise, I would have thought there is value in doing exactly what you say. I would just hesitate about calling that a procurement activity.
Sure. Okay. And so...
Or it might be, a pre-procurement activity.
So some sort of a market sweep, then followed by some process, whether it's...
Yes.
And then my other question is, are you required under the rules, under the formal procurement process, which presumably governs these large contracts, are you required to specify we require this many planes of this exact
No.
specification.
No.
So are you precluded in that procurement process from saying, we require 24/7 coverage
Yes.
of
Yeah.
this geographical section of the ocean?
Well, in fact, we did. You would have heard my evidence previously on the future maritime surveillance concept that Mr Dutton commissioned in 2018. That was precisely that. In other words, we have no preconceived notion of the vehicle or the platform that you would use. And indeed, and we'll unpack this when we come back to you on notice about the FMSC, but that would have had a series of effects. So we've got oil rigs over here, we've got fisheries over there, we've got close waters in the Torres Strait, but we've got big expansive ocean out towards the territories in the Indian Ocean.
Mm-hmm.
If you're a provider, and to the other member's point about whether it's a single provider or a consortium,
Yep.
how would you assemble a series of technologies, systems and other processes to generate an effect to whether it's 24/7 broad? You probably need to get a bit lower than that, because the Commissioner would not just require 24/7 persistent, let's say, but then focal area to either do more concentrated sweeps, say, around oil rigs.
Sure.
Or how do you overfly, for instance, a boat that might be illegally fishing?
Yeah, no, I get that. But whatever the capability is, presumably we're aware of what it is we're seeking in terms of, we need
Yes.
to cover these regions, we need to be able to
Yeah.
follow up quickly.
And that's called your strategic requirement.
Yeah. So I guess what I'm getting at is, you do the market sweep to confirm broadly what's out there. We know the criteria of what it is we're seeking. Why wouldn't you simply put out that process, procurement or whatever the correct term is, early within the 5-year time frame?
Yes.
Say, these are all the things we need. Actually be ambivalent as to whether it's this type of aircraft or this type of UAV or whatever, and then see what comes in. And if it's a combination of UAVs and fixed wing, or if it's whatever, presumably in their documentation and your follow-up with them, they're going to have to justify whether it's believable or not.
Yes.
So in a sense, you don't have to predict whether a UAV can do it, because that will be established during the procurement process.
I'm completely in agreement, and that's exactly what you would do. You still get to the punchline, and indeed I was questioned on this extensively by former Senator Keneally, who would often say, you're doing this FMSC that Mr Dutton's commissioned, is it funded? My only answer ever could be, it's funded to do exactly the examination that Mr Dutton commissioned. A very logical process, be independent as to technology, don't worry about whether it's a kite, a balloon or whatever. And the question still arises, including to not just committees like this, but to the Estimates Committee, is when are you going to market? Senator Keneally, this is what I used to have to say, I don't know.
And that is because you're waiting on the funding for the subsequent 5-year period?
Well, you can't go to tender without. You can't go to the marketplace to say spend potentially millions of dollars coming back with an evaluation just on the say-so of a secretary. A government has to have said, yes, we're going to purchase a maritime surveillance capability that is broadly spec'd in the terms that, let's say, you've just described.
The government didn't go to market, the acting Prime Minister just signed off $1 billion anyway. On the variation.
I don't understand that reference. You've made it several times. The variation was my decision. I don't understand.
Well, the answer to the question on notice, which you provided, said you approved the contract variation.
Yes, correct.
But the Minister and then the acting Prime Minister had to approve the forward allocation of funding before it could be executed, because it's $1 billion.
Yes, you still need an appropriation.
So can I just on the appropriations then?
Yep.
So whether it's with contractor A or whether
Yes.
you start looking to transition in 2025
Yes.
to 27, presumably in the forward estimates and then probably out for the 10-year
Yep.
horizon, you would still have funding.
You've got O&M money. You've got operations.
So you've got, so
maintenance.
you know that in the budget, forward estimates,
There's O&M.
and then you've got money. I don't know. I mean,
Yep.
we'll ask that at estimates, but you've got enough security there to actually go and re-tender the contract for a different.
No, because
So
at
what's
some
actually
point,
provisioned? Oh, maybe this is a question for estimates now.
Maybe
But
can we close on this
come back.
then? In coming back to us, because you said you'd give us some... Oh, sorry, I thought... Yep.
Sorry, can I just address that point very briefly?
Sure.
You can't re-tender for assets that have expired. In other words, that's a cap. You've got to recapitalise the fleet. The lack of funds don't relate to operations and maintenance. That's recurrent. You're right. That's built into the base. Actually,
but it's a service contract. You're not buying aircraft, as I understand it. It's a service contract.
But aren't they recapitalising the fleet from the variation by effectively putting in new technology?
Yes, they are.
So we're getting sort of half new planes or refurbished planes.
Refurbished, yeah.
Through a variation that's operating.
Correct. And so in the end, it's going to have to be a government decision about whether you're comfortable with second-hand refurbished planes, or given our strategic circumstances, do you want to tender for a new fleet? And then that goes to Mr Coleman's point about being agnostic about the type of technology.
But can I just ask, why is that even necessary, though? Because if you say to the market, we need these services, whether it's, you want to go and buy UAVs to provide it, or whether that's your problem. We're providing, broadly this amount of funding to provide this service.
Yeah.
These are the things we need. It might be fixed wing, it might be this type of aircraft, but you, the market, tell us what you can do.
Yeah. No, all of that.
That's what I'm struggling with. I don't understand.
I can agree with that, Mr. Coleman. But as the Commissioner made clear, for a contract which was negotiated in 2006-07, and indeed liquidated damages, as we were reminded by the ANAO, was settled as far back as 07. The contract itself needs to be rebased. That's what I said earlier. It's a contract that's really designed to fly around Australia very close. It's a littoral contract. The lessons of the boats and OSB and other things is that we need to throw the screen further out. We need we need to fly deeper into the ocean. We need to be more persistent at greater range. And so what we've been using is a 2006-07 contract and sort of trying to get out of it a wider area outcome, and we're funded for that, absolutely, and we're trying to stretch it out into the Indian Ocean and elsewhere.
I think the bit that perhaps we're missing, and if I can ask you, we've given you an invitation to give us an explanation about the integrated investment plan proposal and why you think that's necessary. Can you also try and explain to us in a written response this balance in the contract, if you like, or the picture you had in your head between capital versus operating?
Sure.
And yes, I understand from an accounting point of view they're different treatments, and government goes tick or tick.
Yep.
I'm still struggling to understand why the lack of a decision for a full forward integrated investment plan, which is something that you have proposed, precluded you or the previous government from retendering this contract, which would be a mixture of capital or operating. I just can't understand why you can't do that if you don't have the world planned.
And also,
you could have chosen to retender this contract even absent the grander plan that you would have liked.
Well, but if you go back to we have to look at the spend profile on the 06, 07, 08 period. At some point, if you've got 10 Corollas, whether or not you get 10 BMWs or just 10 better Corollas, at some point those old Corollas start to get cannibalised for spare parts. So you still need to buy. Someone has to buy.
I'm not disputing that. I'm disputing or querying why we didn't go and buy the new ones, and I can't understand that that's because we didn't have an integrated investment plan. But the Cabinet could have ticked off buying new ones.
That's true. No,
sorry, that's the point I'm trying to make.
That assertion is true. The government could have decided a single new contract with new capital, which might well be spread over time because it could be a privately financed outcome where the amortisation of the capital extends over time. That's absolutely true. But that's a new procurement. That's not the old contract.
Yep, understand.
But Mr Pizzullo, that is more relevant, that analogy I would have thought to, for example, the Cape class, because ownership actually rests with ABF and Home Affairs of the vessels.
That's true.
So in that case, you're procuring a vessel, or in your analogy, 12 Corollas.
Do you own the planes?
But no, it's a service contract. So this is the thing. So if you could also add in your response...
It's a wet lease.
Yes. So if between a service contract, wet lease, and also an ownership plus then contracts for the ongoing maintenance, it's quite different. And I think in some of your discussions will confuse people because they're two very different types of contracts and very different implications for who owns the asset and who manages the asset.
That's true, Senator. Absolutely, that's true. But as you know, with a wet lease, the private provider has to build a capital component into their charge because they have to depreciate and amortise themselves. So all of those negotiations about this capability, they all occurred in 06, 07, 08.
Yep, but that comes back to the whole purpose of this.
Well,
that comes back very nicely to the whole purpose and to a lot of the findings by ANAO, that it was the contract negotiations in terms of delivering the service that were deficient, and as the Commissioner identified, that there weren't enough, the contract itself was deficient and didn't enable them to do or to direct what they actually wanted under the contract.
Look, I'd have to accept that. I mean, we heard from the officer at the table from the Audit Office that there was a variation around liquidated damages taken in 06, 07. Fair cop, I wasn't there.
Well, yes, indeed, and let's not hang too much on that because we haven't talked about the other 39 variations, many of which happened when you were there. But it does sound like we've kind of got flying old Corollas with a new paint job, and that's the outtake of this for the Australian people and the taxpayer, rather than the best modern technology.
And we're renting them from Avis rather than owning them ourselves.
Nothing's your fault, but we are where we are.
What I would say, Chair, is that it's not just a paint job. We've got... I might
you'd agree with that one.
This was asked. Radars, electro-optic, infrared turrets, mission management systems, radios, direction finders, automatic identification systems.
They've been put in, haven't they?
An inertial navigation system. So it is more than a paint job. I take your point, but it's not quite a paint job.
So it's a new gearbox. We've upgraded. We've got the Apple.
The airframes are the same. They're the workhorse to Dash 8, as you would appreciate. But a lot of the mission equipment to require the technology has been upgraded.
It's an entirely different conversation, but probably pointless at this point, as to how on earth you ensured value for money through a negotiation to recapitalise. But anyway.
I accept that. We should do a full tender. I absolutely accept it. And hopefully the side of December 27.
Can you also just take on notice and explain to me, when I was up in these planes in 2017, we were flying around the line doing this zigzaggy thing, and we spent most of the day or afternoon looking at fishing boats. I'll avoid, to be diplomatic, speculating on which countries the fishing boats were from, but there were 2 or 3.
Yep.
And I said, what happens? And they said, they're just kind of hanging there until night because we don't fly enough night flights to find the fishing boats, and we know they all come across, do their fishing, then run back to the line.
The Rear Admiral, who runs Maritime Border Command, has, as I said earlier, a large planning team of some of the best planners in the world from military and other places. Each month we get our deliberate plans that go to the pilots, and they fly particular zones and areas and particular mission sets. If they decide they want night missions, they'll request it. Now, I have complete confidence in Maritime Border Command. It's been operating for about 30 years in that construct, and the people in there are expert in what they do.
I'm
and
sure
if they want night missions, they'll get night missions.
Yep, and they can only work with what they've got, and we know from this discussion that they know perfectly well there's limitations on what they can ask for because there's not enough pilots and the performance management framework's flawed.
They plan for 105% of the 15,000 hours. That's what they accept, that there's going to be, as I said earlier on, with atmospherics and weather and restrictions and all those things.
I think we've hit the law of diminishing returns here. Can I thank you all for appearing today? There's a little bit to take on notice. I don't think we'll need a second date on this topic. Nice to see you again after 6.5 years here. And we might break for... you get a transcript and a Hansard and all that kind of stuff. I think you're fairly familiar with that. I hope this has been a good warm-up for estimates next week.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
So you can thank us for the gift and the invitation. And we might just break till about 20 past. I'll just confer with colleagues because I think we'll need to scrap one of our following 2 sessions. Can we just break broadcasting and we'll just have a little chat? Thank you. I declare open this public hearing of the Joint Committee of Public Accounts and Audit for the inquiry into Commonwealth grants, and would like to thank the witnesses for being here today. Grants Administration. For the Hansard record, could you each please state your name and the capacity in which you appear before the committee today?
Sam Chard. I'm the Head of Division for Grants Delivery and Business Services with the Department of Industry, Science and Resources.
Neil Mason, Deputy Secretary, Enabling and Business Services, Department of Industry, Science and Resources.
Good morning, Mark Ledoux, Group Manager, Community Grants Hub in the Department of Social Services.
Liz Heffron-Webb, Deputy Secretary, Families and Communities, Department of Social Services.
Nathan Williamson, Deputy Secretary, Governance and Resource Management, Department of Finance.
Shannon Fraser,
First Assistant Secretary of Grants, Data and Assurance in Department of Finance.
Lasanta Samarnaika, Assistant Secretary of Grants Policy Branch in Department of Finance.
Acting Director General. Carla Jago, Group Executive Director, Performance Audit at the ANAO.
Thank you. I take it that we're all happy that you know about Hansard, you know about referring, we all know about public community, and we don't need to read all that out. Great, terrific. We'll call that an efficiency measure. Would you like to make an opening statement?
Chair, if there's
Mr.
time,
Mason?
I'm happy to make
Sure.
a brief opening statement. Firstly, we'd like to thank the committee and the Chair for the opportunity to appear today. I'd start by acknowledging the traditional custodians and the land in which we meet today, the Ngunnawal people, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Since 2016, we've designed, managed and delivered a significant number of grant programs on behalf of Commonwealth agencies through the Business Grants Hub. As you know, we're one of two Commonwealth Grants Hub, which were established under the Streamlining Commonwealth Government Grants Administration Program.
Mason, do you mind speaking up a bit?
Sorry. Yeah, no problem.
Thanks.
The program, as you know, was introduced in 2015-16 to deliver simpler, more consistent and more efficient grants administration across government in line with the government's digital transformation agenda. As a centralised hub, we've spent the last 6 years refining our service offering and building a centre of excellence for grants administration. Since establishment, we've delivered more than 560 grant opportunities for 12 client agencies, including our own, and assessed more than 80,000 applications. We've had a range of systems and processes in place that we're ensuring to strive for consistency and efficiency, and we take assurance very seriously and have built a dedicated team whose role is to undertake assurance on our grant programs and ensure we are compliant with the Commonwealth grant rules and guidelines for the broader government grants administration framework administered by the Department of Finance. We have multiple layers of assurance within that, and we're happy to explain further on that with the committee today. We welcome the inquiry and the ongoing engagement with the ANAO. A number of audits have been undertaken over the last few years addressing the awarding and funding of programs on behalf of agencies that we deliver that for. We've accepted the outcomes in relation to our work and have provided the committee a very brief update today on the status of those recommendations. We regularly engage with our colleagues in the Department of Finance and our colleagues in the other grant hub, and we welcome the opportunity to engage with you today. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr Mason.
I just want to join in acknowledging we're on Ngunnawal country. As you know, the Community Grants Hub delivers grants on behalf of the Department of Social Services and 10 other client agencies. As at 1st of January 2023, we're currently administering 29,054 grants with a total value of 9.8 billion in this financial year. Join my colleague in acknowledging that this has been a learning process for us in establishing the Grants Hub, and we've been developing our models and our assurance and our frameworks in collaboration with our partners and our partners in Department of Finance, and happy to talk through any specific issues. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chair. No opening statement from Finance. Happy to go to questions.
You've tabled your opening statement. I'll pass to Mr Coleman.
Great. Thank you, Chair, and thank you all for being here today. So just want to start out just at the high level. So what is the total cost of administering grants? It might be for finance, administering grants across government?
In terms of the hubs, the hub costs?
No, the total cost of administering grants.
So just while Ms Fraser finds some data, we don't have the total cost across every grant program. We can talk about those grant programs that are administered jointly under the hubs. We can also talk about the level of funding that's provided through those programs.
And so in last financial year, there were over 80,000 grants worth $30.9 billion.
Well, yes, we know that, but that wasn't my question. So is the answer? So is anyone able to answer the question just as a starting point as the total cost of administering grants across government?
Can I just check that we understand it properly? So when you mean administering grants, do you mean program administration costs?
Yeah, running.
Because I think the figure,
not the actual grants themselves, but the administration of grants.
So Ms Fraser, I'm presuming that the $13.9 billion figure you just gave is the money out the door.
Right, that was the grants that are out.
Or is it the money appropriated for those programs?
That's the money that's spent on through the grants, not the administration, the combined...
Yeah, but no, because my understanding of this inquiry, we're trying to get at the hubs and the administration and so on. So I'm just interested in if we have a figure for the total cost of administration.
Yeah, so the total cost of administration of grants through the grants hubs is approximately $140 million per year.
Yep.
But of course, then there are some other grants programs that are run through agencies, and we don't have those costs.
Okay. Okay, so of the 140 million, so that is appropriated for the purpose of these two hubs?
In terms of administration costs for the hubs, it's actually done through portfolio appropriation to the Department of Social Services and through the Department of Industry.
Yep. But sorry, but just to be clear, so the two hubs, regardless of the exact mechanism through which the money flows, cost about $140 million to run, is that right?
Yes.
Per year?
Yes.
Okay. So can I ask, how does that cost compare to whatever happened before the hubs existed?
So prior to the hubs, each entity was responsible for managing their own grants programs.
Yes. And how much did that cost?
That information actually wasn't captured. So as part of an entity's everyday business, they would have, ICT costs, property costs, staffing costs, but they as from a Department of Finance perspective, those costs weren't differentiated in terms of what was the cost to deliver grants within each of those agencies, and a baseline taken at the time. So there was no baseline taken.
So on what basis did I guess the public service advise that incremental cost of $140 million, like what was the rationale as to why spending that additional money would be in the interests of the Commonwealth?
So that $140 million is the current cost of running the hubs. When they were introduced back in 2015, they were managing a smaller workload, so I would suspect it was actually a smaller cost. The proposition for a shared services hub model was put forward, it's actually by the DTO, I think, that's a digital transformation organisation, as part of other efficiencies at the time. So it was the running of a shared service model, being more efficient than each individual agency running their own.
And so,
Sorry, I might just elaborate. So the 140 million is not additional to what we were spending prior to the Community Grants Hub. We've essentially, what was being spent prior to the Community Grants Hub was distributed, very hard to measure, and amongst all agencies. So DSS has collected all the functions around administration of grants and put them into a grants hub. And other departments have provided staff to us as well. So we received a big transfer of staff from Department of Health, for example. So I'm just trying to clarify, it's not everyone who was doing it before plus another 140 million worth of people. It's 140 million worth of people net. But the before situation, I think Ms Fraser said, we don't actually have a metric on what we were spending before.
If we don't know how much we spent before, how do we know what proportion of the 140 million is incremental?
I think that's something that's been raised in the audit around, because we didn't have sufficient benchmarking, it's been hard for us to elaborate on the benefits.
Okay. For the grants that are administered outside the hubs, because I think in reading the reports, it sounds like many, but not everything has gone into the hubs, I think.
Correct.
So what processes do we have in place to measure that? Because presumably, it sounds like, given we didn't know 6 years ago, we presumably have taken action to better capture what's happening outside of the hubs.
So when an individual policy proposal comes forward for consideration by government and it's a grants program, it will include the costs of administering that grants program. In the case of a program that ultimately is administered by the hub, those costs are provided to the hub to allow that. For those grants where that is not the case, they are the entity that's administering those grants would take those costs.
Okay, so there's not a kind of a permanent grants function in any of the departments outside of the hubs?
There's not a shared service function. There is in the research agencies, in HMRC.
Yeah. But, so, in the research sector, there's
NHMRC.
Thank you.
Yeah.
But from an entity perspective, each entity sets up their business processes to suit their business. So some agencies that do a lot of grants work will have a centralised grants area. Other entities will have that spread across policy areas with grants expertise within the policy area. So
and do we know how much that costs? I'm just trying to
not to hand.
Sorry.
Not to hand.
Okay.
No.
Could you take that on notice? Because I think the problem, if the issue we're trying to resolve here is the efficiency of the administration of grants, I think what we're saying is we can have a discussion about the grants hubs, and obviously there's a lot of issues in the audit report, but it seems to me that's not entirely holistic because there's obviously stuff that still happens outside of the grants hubs as well. And if one of the lessons from before was we didn't have enough insight into what's happening in grants administration, then presumably someone within the public service would have turned their minds to the question of what's happening now outside of the hubs.
So we are looking at trying to establish that baseline data. One of the difficulties is that sometimes in organisations beyond the hub, they will have people who are working on multiple functions. And so being able to directly attribute cost to a grants program is somewhat more difficult than it is in the case of the grants hubs, because they are dedicated functions where their full costs are going towards the administration of grants. But in individual entities, they can have people and resources working across a number of things, which could include grants, but also be other programs or policy issues, and attributing cost is difficult.
But if we'd identified 6 years ago that was a problem, presumably it wouldn't have taken 6 years to work through the issues.
So we know the funding that is provided on a grant, any funding that's provided to an organisation to administer a grant, we can identify that. But the actual granular costs within the organisation is somewhat more difficult, and that's something we're working on because it's important to be able to have that apples for apples comparison.
Well, indeed, and that's why I asked the question, because obviously in this oversight role we have, it seems to me that it's obviously very good to have this discussion about the two hubs, but it's an incomplete discussion. And I think what you're saying is, to paraphrase, at least 6 years ago we identified that it was difficult to identify the costs of administering grants, which is part of the rationale for establishing the hub and spending $140 million a year on it. But during those intervening 6 years we have not resolved the issue, and correct me if I'm wrong, but we have not resolved the issue of actually identifying the costs of administering the other grants, apart from the ones that have a specific NPP associated with them.
So, yes, I would say we can certainly identify any associated NPP, but being able to do that granular analysis for comparison is difficult.
When you say granular analysis, it could be many millions of dollars of taxpayers' money, presumably.
I'm talking about the function, not the granular in terms of the size of the dollars.
Okay, no worries. Thank you. So just to move on to the hubs then. So could we just run through those figures again? So how many grants programs again is it that we're administering at the moment?
That the grants hubs are administering?
Yeah.
It's 40,000. Oh, sorry. In financial year 2021-22, it was 40,000.
Yeah.
With a total value of $10 billion.
Okay. And so have we done analysis on the cost per grant? Because I guess probably the most sensible metric is an individual application, because it has to be processed and so on. But have we looked at how much it costs us to do that and whether or not that's good value for money?
I might just offer, in terms of the cost of hubs, obviously my colleagues from the hubs can provide a little bit more detail, but it's not a flat cost per grant. And the other thing I just wanted to touch on is that there are other benefits. Cost is obviously very important, and we've acknowledged through the response to the ANR audits that we need to be better at our benefits measurement, and we're working really closely with our hubs to set up some measures. But there have been other benefits that have come from consolidating a shared service into hubs, particularly from an end user perspective. So, grant applicants prior to hubs and prior to Grant Connect, if you wanted to know what grant offerings were available, you had to go to each entity's website and search for it and look for it. Each entity had different processes that then those grant applicants had to navigate. By consolidating it through grants hubs and with Grant Connect, there's now a single portal for grant applicants to come to, and at that website there's a lot of detail there.
Thanks. Yep.
And the efficiencies that have gained through connection back to the hubs.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure we've established there are efficiencies. I think the point about it's easier to see what grants are available is well made.
Apologies, I meant process efficiencies as opposed to cost efficiencies.
So have we looked at this issue of the cost effectively per grant or per grant program and worked out whether or not we think that is good value for the taxpayer?
So I would just note there that grant programs are incredibly diverse.
Yeah, I think we're familiar with that.
I understand. So my point is that volunteer grants, for example, which is a $5,000 grant.
If you're lucky.
Up to $5,000 grant is very different from when we're giving $1 million grant. And so a cost per grant is going to have to be a graded sort of.
I understand. And look, and I should disclose, I've, in previous ministerial role, had, grant programs within my portfolio, so I have some understanding of it. But so have we done any analysis of the efficiency of basically whether or not the $140 million is being spent as efficiently as possible? And the answer might be no. So I'm not asking you to, create an answer if the answer is no, but that's my question.
We haven't done it specifically. What we can do, and we provide our clients with a rates card for the elements of the grant we manage, and that's a sense of proportionality and complexity around the grant. And at the end of that, they are invoiced against the final costs. So they have access to data themselves, our clients, and we do.
But your clients are the departments, right, who generally don't have a choice.
That's correct.
So it's not a particularly, equal client-partner relationships, and that's just reflecting what you say it's going to cost. That's not reflecting whether or not it's an efficient process that you're running.
I understand your point. I'm just answering the question. But that's the sort of metrics we have available as far as grant costs. The further analysis of your point, no, that hasn't been done.
Yeah. Okay. And then just so back at the start of this process, just from reading the audit report, I think there was a figure of $400 million of annual benefits that was suggested, and the report effectively shows that no benefit has been identified. And I also noticed from the survey of the departments who actually use the hubs that the departments actually said, well, actually, there's been no benefit or a negative impact of using the hubs. So that's a very long way from a $400 million annual benefit, isn't it? Basically, all of your clients, if that's the term, basically saying there's been no benefit or the benefit's been negative. Like, that's not good, is it?
So the work that the ANAO did, they sent a survey to a number of staff. We don't have access to who responded to that survey, what level of seniority there were, whether they would understand the kind of efficiencies, etc. They were giving their perspective, and that's not an unexpected response, because a lot of departments lost staff to the hubs. They've had to collaborate with the hubs where they used to do things on their own. So it's not, to me, an unexpected kind of qualitative response. They weren't actually giving figures about it being more expensive. They were giving their qualitative impression that they felt it was not as efficient.
And look, and it may be, if you're suggesting that, that they don't, I don't know, that there's a problem with their viewpoint, but that is a little curious, given the purpose of the survey was to ask their viewpoint. But, I mean, it would seem to me if basically every department that's asked about it has said this has been either neutral or negative, I mean, that would surely provoke some pretty serious reflection within the hub's administration. Because that's sort of, we started out saying we're going to save $400 million a year. We've actually saved nothing. We've got every user saying that it's either neutral or negative, and we don't, from the audit report, seemingly have any meaningful benefits derived. I mean, does it make sense to have these hubs? I mean, should government be looking at, perhaps disbanding the hubs and going back to how it was before? It's a question. It's a question.
So the survey that you referred to wasn't conducted by us, and I would say that that is not the overwhelming feedback that I get from speaking to my counterparts across the Commonwealth. So there are probably differing points of view, as Ms Heffron-Webb said, and the surveys, I'm not questioning the survey, I'm saying that's not the lived experience that I have in speaking to colleagues across the Commonwealth.
Just to add to that as well, as part of actioning the recommendations around hub and possible improvements to the hub model, we've undertaken a number of conversations with a number of different entities as well, and the overwhelming feedback is keeping the hub model and how do we look to improve it as opposed to.
Okay, and sorry, I should have asked the audit office, because I think I was quoting from. Up to you if you wanted to comment on that survey. Or.
I think Ms Chalmers can comment on it as a survey professional.
So the table A3 in the audit report provides a detailed breakdown of the total number of respondents and across all the questions that were asked that were relevant to the audit report. So it was an attempt to survey all relevant people that were identified through records that were obtained from the departments, and it reflects the views of the people who were surveyed.
And I'll ask my last question, so I'm conscious of...
Can I just add,
of course.
The decision to do a survey in an audit is where there's no other evidence of feedback in a data structured way.
Right.
So I acknowledge that Mr Williamson has different lived experience, but as you'll note in the audit report, data quality is an issue, and benchmarking and baselining absent or not progressing, efficiency measures not progressing. And so to get a data set that gives you an enriched audit evidence base, sometimes we use a survey.
Thank you. Sorry, I'll finish up because I'm conscious of taking up a little bit of time, but just I think what concerns me here is that the gap between the proposal initially when this scheme was set up and what's actually happened is immense, objectively. If other departments or other areas said, look, we're going to generate $400 million of savings through doing this, and then couldn't subsequently demonstrate that, from what I can see, even $1 of benefits has been derived, there'd be consequences, there'd be changes, there'd be very deep reflection on what's gone wrong. And I'm not sure from the tenor of what I've seen that, that is the posture of the officials that are responsible for this area. So I would, and look, I don't know what the committee's, report on these things ultimately, but I would certainly be encouraging very serious reflection on why this has been so very different to what was originally envisaged, and really particularly on some of these issues around the efficiency and the fact that we can't identify what's happening outside of the hubs. We can't, or haven't attempted, it seems, to identify the actual efficiency of what's being done within the hubs. I think there's some very serious questions there. But anyway, so
I'll hand over to Dr. Anandaraja, but I'll just make the point that if another agency came to finance and said, hey, we've got an idea and we're going to pencil in $400 million of savings, and then didn't make the savings, finance itself would be pretty grumpy with them, given you're both the policy owner and you're the finance department. Dr. Anandaraja?
Thank you. I was a little bit late, so I missed your opening statement, unfortunately, but I will say this, that I am I've been an end user of this system, right? So I was a doctor and a researcher before coming into Parliament, so I'm very familiar with Grants Connect, and I've applied through it for NHMRC, MRFF, and even DISA grants, not through Grant Connect, but through another platform.
Lived experience.
Yeah, I actually do have lived experience on writing more grants than I can even count, and they were all $1 million plus. They were high-end health research grants. So my experience of this, and having supervised others who are doing this, is that the portal is useful for alerting you as to when these grants appear, right? But that's it. That's it. That's as far as it goes. What happens then becomes a nightmare for end user, because it is then managed through the universities who liaise with the NHMRC and the MRFF, for example, all of whom have arcane submission requirements. I'm talking about things like margins, the size of your font, this, that, where you put your name, what number, how you number your pages, so on and so forth. Whereas I did submit once through DISA, and I found that whole experience was far superior. It was an online template, word count, character count, there was no mucking around, standardised. The problem, I think, for end users, and this speaks to the inefficiencies that David was talking about, is that they are real. Past your portal, what happens is when it goes out to NHMRC, MRFF, and the university, you are losing line of sight. And my own experience and the experience of other researchers is that this is a clunky, antiquated, unstandardised system, which is far too much manual input and oversight from university. And the other thing I would say is that universities themselves do not have sufficient communication between NHMRC, huge budget provided by the taxpayer, and MRFF. And as a result, when you are ineligible for these grants, you can be, after having done the work, which takes a month of writing, right, of your time from your day job, you then become, it's cancelled. You are cancelled from both NHMRC and MRFF. So I think there needs, and that is a complete waste of money and time, everyone's money and time. So I do think you need to look beyond what you're just putting up on that portal, and you need to be really reaching down into university, NHMRC, MRFF organisations and questioning them as to how they can improve their systems, because I can tell you now there is not a single happy medical researcher in this country. Not one.
Thank you for that feedback. I think I can only respond by saying the NHMRC and the MRFF grants are administered by those organisations, and we don't have a role in those, so it's...
But you advertise it on Grants Connect,
sorry,
don't you?
can I just check? I'll just check that we're on the same page. So there's Grants Connect, which notifies, yes, and that's whole of government. And then there's Grants Hub, which you have some programs as clients, some departments, and then you will manage the administration. But the grants that Dr. Anandaraj is talking about are not in Grants Hub. Is that correct?
Correct. It's very confusing.
Yeah. However, the Grants Connect part of it seems to work well, and that does raise some interesting questions about the experience of people who are outside the Grants Hub framework, which builds on what Mr. Coleman said. Can I just perhaps check? I just want to check our understanding of this is correct, because we haven't had time to have a pre-brief and get our heads around all of the facts. So, government received advice from finance with input from DTA and others that you could save $400 million and have a whole bunch of other benefits if you invest $100 million in centralised grants, shared service if you like. Is that basically it? A little more complex than that, but...
I'm happy to continue along those lines.
Okay, something like that. And so we've done that. And the critique from the Audit Office on reflection seems to boil down to a few things. I just want to check we're on the same page. That there wasn't enough data, evidence-based data, to underpin the advice to government at that time. So I'm getting nods from the Audit Office, but I'll invite you to comment. So the proposition, if you like, there wasn't enough evidence in the Audit Office's view to inform the advice that was put forward. Government, nevertheless, on the face of it, sounds like a pretty good deal. Who wouldn't take it? Said, OK, let's do that. And then the Audit Officers said, along the way now, having a look at how it's been implemented, there's a whole bunch of issues and they're outlined in the submission. In response to that, I'm just checking we've got the timeline right. In response to that, you've accepted those recommendations and you're doing a bit of a retrofit as best you can, because you can't invent data that doesn't exist, to try and come up with a better performance management framework, a benefits management plan, and be able, sometime from now, to have a better account of yourselves. I just want to check, is that a reasonable... Because I just want to make sure we're on the same page factually.
Yeah. So in terms of the audit, yes, Finance accepted the 3 recommendations. First one particularly going to that, the point you've made around data and baseline data and being able to do the comparisons. We are working with the hubs on that particular recommendation. The second one was around developing a future plan for the hubs. We are in the middle of doing that as we are doing further work on the broader grants program and providing advice to this government. And the third one went to data sets as well, and so yes, we are working on that. We acknowledge that at the outset the baseline data was insufficient to be able to measure the outcomes.
Or justify the advice which you gave to government.
I can't. It's difficult for me to comment on advice that went to government in 2015.
Sorry, just briefly pick up on that. I think it's...
I'm genuinely not trying to be hostile with that account either. I'm just trying to check we're on the same page, because I do have a few questions arising.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to I do think it's a very important point, and finance is an institution, not an individual. So presumably the institution of finance had a rationale and must have had some numbers to come up with $400 million, presumably.
You didn't just make it up.
So the advice that went to government initially was by the Digital Transformation Office, not the Department of Finance.
Oh, okay.
Right.
So that is why, that's another reason why it's a little difficult for finance to go to that.
Did finance offer any advice to say that they agreed with it, or was...
I would have to take that on notice.
Take that on notice?
Yeah.
If you could, because you are usually all over with the sharp pen and the assumptions and that, and I mean that as a great compliment actually. Mm-hmm. There's a level of discipline and rigour that you bring to people whether they like it or not in ordinary cases. So it's not usual that we sort of hear from the Audit Office that the underpinning evidence of something finance has gone over just wasn't solid.
So we'll take that on notice, but as I said, the advice...
Can I just invite the Audit Office to comment on...
organisation.
And anyone else, if you've got that account wrong, because it's really just a few things I want to go to, won't take too much time. If we can get back some data or encourage you to think about through your evaluation going forward. Audit Office, Acting Auditor General, do you have anything to add on that?
No, I think there's a consistent with our statement, there's a summary there. I think there were things that were part of the program that weren't delivered, so the data warehouse, for example, which had an efficiency component to it. And I think it's important in accepting the recommendations that the committee gets a view quickly of what's happening.
Yep, okay. So I've got an instinct, but that's all I can have, I suppose, from having worked in government and run numerous grants programs and played with similar things in the Victorian government. I've got an instinct that this is a good idea, not because I think it probably saves that much money, but because it improves the quality, because you're actually centralising a capability that otherwise is distributed and is often done badly, particularly in small agencies that don't do it very often. So that's an instinct. And I did think that did seem to come through in the analysis, that you get more consistency, you get better skills, you lower risk, and hopefully end up with fewer utterly egregious audit reports on grants programs. However, I'm deeply sceptical from seeing the fetish of shared services pushed by treasuries and finances across state and territories and the Commonwealth, that the savings promised ever really materialise. And this seems to be another case study, because no one can prove it. Can you explain, and you might need to take it on notice, to what extent are the costs of what I'd call managing the interface, were they taken into account in the business case, and are they being taken into account in your assessment of the ongoing friction? I'll just give you the example so we're clear. I worked in a department and some bright spark in finance thought it was a great idea to centralise HR. Great, so we did that. All it meant was that each DepSec employed a couple of people to manage their relationship with the new centralised HR department. We basically didn't save any money because the senior, at some point, the client has to manage the relationship. And so I delved in, read some academic studies. The Centretex disaster in Victorian government's probably got a whole different range of things, but the academic studies seem to say the savings are never really materialised because everyone employs more people to manage the interface, yet it just gets washed out in time. So I'd just like to invite your comment and explain to me how I'm wrong. The whole Department of Defence. We won't put that on the record.
Sorry, I don't mean to be difficult, but can you clarify what question you're actually asking us?
So, to what extent, in the case that was put forward by finance or in the work that you're doing at the moment, when you're counting the cost, if you like, are you counting the cost of the people on the client side who have to then manage the relationship and manage the deliverables and manage the interface?
So, in formulating the advice that we're currently undertaking to provide to government, we have been doing extensive consultation with departments and agencies that both use the hubs and don't use the hubs to understand the operations.
And in those extensive consultations with the departments that do use the hubs, are you counting the cost of their staff who are managing the relationship with the hubs?
We're trying to look at all aspects of how the interaction between client agencies and the hubs.
Do the hubs have anything to say? And I'm someone, as I said, who actually thinks it makes sense. It's a good idea overall, having read a lot of audit reports on pretty bad grants administration.
I'm happy to kind of comment from my perspective, and I speak as someone who currently has responsibility for the Community Grants Hub, but have previously been in other agencies that have had to use the hub, etc. So I'm kind of have seen it from both sides. And I think you're right in that the department who now has to use another department's kind of services is suspicious, is likely to have to develop some new functions that are that friction point and that engagement point with that department. And there's also a sense of loss of control, and that's what I was referring to when I was talking about the responses to the survey. I wasn't trying to say the survey wasn't valid. I'm saying there's some emotional experiences that public servants have when functions go that they will necessarily kind of hold for a while. My view is that the improvement and the quality argument is probably stronger than the efficiency argument, because and I don't think that's kind of wholly true, because I think there are some systems efficiencies, etc., that we have been able to slowly kind of improve, but really the benefits have been more around the consistency, around really strict and clear application of Commonwealth grants, rules and guidelines, about people with expertise in kind of working with organisations. So I think your assertion to me sounds intuitively right, but I'm not doing the work Mr Williamson's doing of going around asking the other agencies. So.
Mr Chair, and I think I'd just make a few high-level comments and then see if Ms Charles wants to chime in. I think the intuition, could be right. However, I'm not getting a sense, noting I'm quite new to this space, that we've had a lot of that feedback from the client agencies we are working with at the moment. I think one of the values we can present in having a holistic picture is presenting information back that individual agencies may not necessarily be able to accomplish their own. And we've also built quite a lot of expertise now within that centralised space, which in time, should drive further efficiency, noting we've already talked about the baseline not necessarily being there. So I'll just see if Ms Chard want to add anything to that.
Yeah, thanks. I think there's probably a couple of points that are worth making. The Department of Industry's hub is what we would describe as an end-to-end service. So I'd suggest that it's easier for us to see the administration cost associated with a grant than it might be for others. On average, our administration costs are 4% of the total value of the grant program. Now there's a few kind of marginal swings and roundabouts, but by and large, it turns out to be 4% in administration costs of the total value of the grant. We run a pricing model that does allocate some costs specific to particular grants, but then there's some kind of broader overheads that might be applied to an entire program. So it's not quite so easy to get down to that granular level of detail of applying an administration cost per individual grant, but at the program level, you can see the 4%. I'd also just acknowledge that we're dealing with different kinds of stakeholders in the grants hubs, different kinds of stakeholders that are delivering grants to different kinds of markets, and the complexity of those grants programs are quite different. My understanding from the ANAO survey was that the feedback from the clients of the Department of Industry Hub were largely positive. And we were quite buoyed by that. We've done quite a bit of work since the audit to try and lift our data quality, in addition to the work that we're doing and the engagement with the Department of Industry on data. So we've created a dedicated data reporting team that's focused on improving the data issues that we've identified. We've made some amendments to our systems to try and capture more data, and we're doing an internal audit of our data and data quality at the moment that will help us kind of systematically address some of those data issues while the broader whole of government systems are being looked at.
Mindful we're running over time, I'll just try and finish in 5. We've got a whole bunch of detailed questions for the report we can put on notice. Can I just ask one other issue now while you're here, and you might want to reflect on it and give us additional info. In a number of the audit reports, it might have been, I'm struggling, I think it might have been one of the industry grants, maybe. Anyway, there was, I think it was one, I think it was I think it was the regional, one of the regional grants ones, where you needed a lot of commercial assessment as part of the assessment process. Plus there was just the workshopping, if you like. We had a discussion a few years ago, and I was quite mystified about the extent of the work that seemed to be outsourced to PwC and firms which was not highly skilled. It wasn't the commercial assessment bit, it was the reading and scoring and typing crap up and putting it in the system. What analysis do you do? And I think there was sort of a tacit admission, but no one could say it, that some of this was driven by the ASL cap. What analysis do you do as to the most efficient way to actually deliver at the lowest cost? How do you strike that balance between APS staff, surge workforce, because grants are kind of peaky, and when you decide to use one of the big four for doing work which clearly on the face of it could be done in the public service? I'm just curious about how you make those judgments.
Chair, I'm happy to start if that's okay. I think from our end, obviously we look to understand the pipeline that might be coming through, and that's obviously driven through budgets and working really closely with policy partners on what they may be putting to government for consideration as part of a budget, and then understanding what the potential that might look like in terms of both complexity but then volume for the way in which we service that. We do have some arrangements in place where we can flex by using a third party to support with those administrative activities, but we make those choices based on the current pipeline and the long-term kind of trajectory on that. Some of our grant programs have run for many years, and so we build a good knowledge of how they work, and therefore can achieve reasonable volume and efficiency through people that are using that repeatedly. But our core base, I think, is roughly about 300 odd folk at the moment, employed by us running that hub.
So you've got about 300 people. How many does DSS have?
Across the board, administering all parts of the grant, so that's assessment, it's nearly about 900 headcount, just a bit under.
Okay.
From an assessment services perspective, as our colleagues pointed out, we don't necessarily offer an end-to-end process, so you can purchase our assessment process if you like.
Right.
So we'll do that in-house. So we work a lot with health grants, so the selection and assessment is normally done by them.
Yep.
So their processes are over them. We will then establish and subsequently manage or acquit the grant. But in-house, we would have a small team that varies. They're predominantly ongoing employees, but we will surge from time to time with APS contractors, once again, to meet the demand.
And as you would expect, we do the kind of scheduling about what's coming up, what to expect,
Yep.
but you get the unexpected, and we have recently had to kind of quickly surge by a number of staff to get a certain number of grants out.
And one of the advantages that we've got, is that we can cross-skill our staff. So as certain parts of the grant program need more attention, I can have more staff doing assessment work than might be managed work. So that is one of the efficiencies we can certainly offer.
We don't outsource routine grants work to third parties.
Can you each take on notice and perhaps just say for the last 3 or 4 years, I'll be sensible about it. I'm trying to get a flavour and an indication, not go on some frolic or witch hunt, but just give us a sense of the FTE, the dollar value, number of contracts that were outsourced for assessment or the administration purposes, and advice as to, given you're planning your pipeline, whether you think there'll be a change in that balance, given you've got a different set of policy parameters with the new government's policies to return that flexibility to agencies to work out the cheapest way to deliver something.
And on that, if you could, on your last point, Heffron Webb, about some grants, there are still staff in other departments who do part of that process. So if you could, which ones you administer, end to end with your staff, and I'm not expecting you to know exactly how many health have, for example, but we can ask that separately, and so we can then see where, who else has staff doing some of the grants process.
Yep, sure.
That's just to get us a better understanding under the bonnet, if you like, without trying to understand everything you do. Any other questions for now? We've got a whole bunch, but I think we can put these on notice pretty comfortably.
I've got...
Oh, sure. And then I'll go to the Audit Office, unless there's anything you want to add at the moment to the Audit Office.
So can I just ask, with the original project, so it went to government, it was from finance and DTR, it was approved. Now, the just over $106 million that was allocated to set the program up, who was responsible for, where did that 106 go to, and who managed the development, the project plan, if you like, for how this program was going to be set up and operate, and the division of responsibilities between the two departments, and who developed, was there one plan for both of you, or were you funded to do things go your own way for business and for community grants? How did that actually operate, and who was accountable for what pieces?
We might try to give you a bit of an overview and then hand to the hubs, if that's okay.
So the 106.7 million over 4 years that you referred to, $99.3 million went to DSS for upgrade its systems and to establish the Community Grants Hub, and 7.4 million came to finance as part of program governance work and to do the high-level business process.
So with the governance oversight, so finance was responsible for oversighting the development and implementation of both hubs.
So the overall program, yes, but the actual individual development of the hubs was with the respective entities.
Yeah, but in terms of what it was going to look like and what they were going to do, who was accountable for the delivery of both of those hubs?
So finance retained accountability for the overall program.
Okay.
But the actual administration operation of the hubs was with the respective entities. So I would say it's joint responsibility.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, joint responsibility for implementation between the two departments, but finance was accountable for the overall program oversight.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So having a look, and given there's not a lot of time, having a look at the audit report findings, I mean, we've read some pretty dreadful audit reports, but this one, it's hard to see what actually went right in terms of the initial implementation of this. So the design and governance was not effective, which finance were accountable for. Planning was not seen through to completion. The benefits realisation framework, and this was all about benefit realisation, so the framework was delivered but never implemented. And so while we've had some discussion, there was no process to not only that was implemented to account for any benefits in terms of the delivery, but also, as Ms Heffron-Webb and some of the other officials have talked about, the benefits were going to be realised through greater efficiency in the processing and greater consistency and better service, basically, both for the people who are administering it, your staff, and also for the users. But it does not appear that when it was rolled out, well, I mean, I just cannot see any redeeming features about how finance rolled this out. So you've given a program to two different, so presumably the two departments, you were given this job, given money, and you developed different, so you used very different systems, different processes, and so you developed things within your own abilities and what you actually had available. Is that right?
So certainly DSS had a project management approach around the rollout of the hubs, which I think is commented on in the report. That's right. We were reporting regularly through to finance about the progress and the status and where we're up to. So I don't know if you've got anything.
Yeah, and Senator, similarly, I'll just ask if Ms Beck has...
So just on that, so on DSS, so you used most of that money to upgrade existing IT systems?
Yeah, we had an antiquated grants system, you might even remember it, called FOFMS, which had a lot of issues, and so the large part
I'm
of
getting the shakes already. So you did that, and what did industry do?
Hi, my name is Sally Bectus. I'm the General Manager of the Business Grants Hub. My understanding is that we didn't get additional funding to establish the hub. What was then Oz Industry, we did have a number of industry grants that we were managing. We did consolidate that. We do, the system we had wasn't suffice to move forward. We purchased a system called the Grants Management System, which is the system we use that provides the end-to-end service. As noted before, we do work very closely, but in terms of the establishment and working through, that was all managed in-house.
Okay, thank you. I'll put some more, ask for many more questions, but I'll put them on notice given the time, so thank you.
Yeah, thank you. There'll be a bunch of questions come on notice, but they're things which are probably better answered on notice, such as the Audit Committee some days. You get the Hansard, you can make the corrections. There's some questions on notice, and thank you very much for appearing today. Thank you.
Thanks, Chair.
Declare the hearing closed.